Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a battlefield so vast it stretches from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Forests, frozen lakes, endless plains, entire cities swallowed by fire. Now imagine millions of men marching into that space, not into trenches that barely move for years, but into a war of sweeping invasions, collapsing empires, starvation, revolution, and total annihilation. This was not a side theater. This was not a distraction from the Western Front. This was the Eastern Front of the First World War, and it was a slaughter so immense, so chaotic, and so transformative that it destroyed 3 empires and reshaped the entire map of Europe forever. While the world remembers the mud of Verdun and the trenches of the Somme, far to the east entire armies were being encircled and erased in days. At Tannenberg, a Russian army vanished. In Galicia, hundreds of thousands fell in fields that most people today cannot even place on a map. Villages were burned. Civilians were deported by the millions. Ethnic hatred exploded into pogroms and forced marches. Soldiers froze in winters so brutal that rifles jammed and men simply laid down in the snow and never rose again. This was war on a scale of movement and destruction that dwarfed almost everything happening in France. And then something even more extraordinary happened. In the middle of this carnage, one of the greatest empires on earth, the Russian Empire, simply began to collapse from the inside. Its soldiers stopped obeying orders. Its railways failed. Its cities starved. Its Tsar abdicated. Revolution ignited. And while the guns were still firing at the front, a new political force seized power, promising peace, bread, and land, and dragged the entire war into a completely different future. The Eastern Front was not just a battlefield. It was the crucible that gave birth to the Soviet Union. It shattered Austria-Hungary. It destabilized Germany. It unleashed civil wars that would rage long after 1918. And yet, despite millions of dead, soldiers and civilians alike, this theater of war remains overshadowed, almost forgotten in popular memory. Over the next hours, we're going to step into that vast, brutal landscape. We will follow the first Russian invasions into East Prussia, the encirclement at Tannenberg, the Great Retreat, the thunder of the Brusilov Offensive, the collapse of discipline, the revolutions of 1917, and the harsh peace that tore Eastern Europe apart. We will see how decisions made in panic and pride sent entire nations spiraling into chaos. And we will understand why the war in the East was not merely a chapter of the First World War, but the beginning of the violent 20th century as we know it. Because this is the story of the forgotten slaughter. And once you see it unfold, you will never look at the First World War the same way again. Chapter 1. A continent divided. The powder keg before 1914. The train has stopped. Smoke hangs in the summer air. A crowd gathers in confusion, then panic. A young man steps forward, raises a pistol, and fires. In that split second in Sarajevo, a handful of bullets tear through the quiet morning and through the fragile balance of an entire continent. Within weeks, millions of men will be marching. Within months, empires will be bleeding. But on this day, no one yet understands that Eastern Europe, vast, restless, and volatile, is about to become one of the greatest killing fields in modern history. Long before the shots are fired, the East is already trembling. 3 empires dominate the landscape. The Russian Empire stretching from Poland to the Pacific, the Austro-Hungarian Empire straddling Central Europe like a patchwork quilt of restless nations, and Imperial Germany, newly powerful, newly ambitious, standing at the heart of the continent. On maps, their borders look clean and defined. On the ground, they are anything but. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is not a single people. It is a fragile mosaic. Germans in Vienna, Hungarians in Budapest, Czechs in Prague, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Poles, Ukrainians, dozens of languages, cultures, loyalties. It is an empire held together by tradition and force, not by unity. In its eastern provinces, Slavic nationalism simmers. Young men whisper about independence. Secret societies pass pamphlets in dim taverns thick with tobacco smoke. Vienna fears what it cannot fully control, the idea that its own subjects might one day turn against it. To the south lies the Balkans, a region Europeans call the powder keg. It is mountainous, fractured, fiercely proud. The Ottoman Empire has retreated, leaving behind small, ambitious states hungry for territory and prestige. Serbia, in particular, dreams of a greater Slavic homeland, a kingdom that would unite all South Slavs under one banner. In Belgrade, nationalist fervor pulses like a heartbeat. To Austria-Hungary, Serbia is not merely a neighbor. It is a threat, a spark capable of igniting rebellion within the empire's own Slavic provinces. And then there is Russia. The Russian Empire sees itself as the protector of the Slavs. Panslavism, the belief that Slavic peoples share a common destiny, flows through its political culture like a current. Russian newspapers speak of brotherhood. Russian diplomats speak of influence. Russian generals speak of warm water ports and access to the Mediterranean through the Turkish Straits. In St. Petersburg, the Balkans are not just a distant concern. They are a doorway to power. Yet beneath the imperial grandeur, Russia is anxious. It is vast but uneven. Industrialization has come late. Railroads crisscross the empire, but they are thin threads stretched across enormous distances. The army is massive, millions of men in theory, but many lack modern rifles. Officers argue over doctrine. Reform struggles against tradition. The empire's strength is real, but so are its weaknesses. Between these three powers sits Germany, disciplined, industrial, efficient. Since its unification in 1871, Germany has risen rapidly. Its factories hum. Its rail networks are among the best in the world. Its army is meticulously planned, drilled, and confident. German military thinkers believe that speed and precision can overcome larger numbers. Their strategy is like a carefully wound clock. If it starts ticking, it must run without interruption. Germany binds itself to Austria-Hungary through alliance. The logic is simple. If Austria is threatened by Russia, Germany will stand beside it. If Russia mobilizes, Germany must act. In peacetime, this alliance seems defensive. In crisis, it will become a chain pulling nations into catastrophe. Tension rises sharply in the years before 1914. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 redraw borders and humiliate the Ottoman Empire. Serbia expands, gaining territory and confidence. Austria watches nervously as Serbian influence grows. In Vienna's ministries, maps are spread across polished tables. Fingers trace potential fault lines. What if Serbian nationalism spreads north? What if Bosnia, annexed by Austria only a few years earlier, erupts? In Bosnia, resentment is already alive. The province is under Austro-Hungarian rule, but many of its young men feel no loyalty to Vienna. They dream of unity with Serbia. Among them is a frail, intense student named Gavrilo Princip. He believes that a single dramatic act can shake an empire. On a bright June morning in 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visits Sarajevo. The streets are lined with curious onlookers. Carriages roll slowly. The smell of horse sweat and summer dust lingers in the air. A bomb is thrown. It misses. The motorcade changes course. Confusion spreads. And then, by chance or fate, the Archduke's car stops directly in front of Princip. 2 shots, echoing in the narrow street. The Archduke and his wife slump forward. Blood stains their uniforms. The crowd screams. And in chancelleries across Europe, telegraphs begin to click. Austria-Hungary sees an opportunity to crush Serbia once and for all. But it hesitates. Russia looms behind Serbia like a giant shadow. Vienna seeks assurance from Berlin. Germany responds with what later historians will call the blank check, a promise of full support, even if it means war with Russia. The logic tightens. Austria drafts an ultimatum to Serbia, deliberately harsh, almost impossible to accept. It demands that Austrian officials be allowed to investigate inside Serbian territory. It demands suppression of nationalist groups. It demands humiliation. Serbia, fearful but defiant, accepts most of the demands, but not all. Austria declares war. At first, the crisis still feels regional. Artillery thunders along the Danube. Serbian villages shake. But Russia now faces a choice. If it abandons Serbia, it loses prestige and influence in the Balkans. If it intervenes, it risks war with Austria and Germany. Russian generals begin to discuss mobilization. Mobilization in 1914 is not merely preparation. It is commitment. Armies of this size cannot assemble quietly. Reservists receive telegrams. Horses are requisitioned. Railways are commandeered. Think of it like lighting a fuse that cannot be extinguished once it begins to burn. Russia's mobilization plan is complex and imperfect. Its rail network is less dense than Germany's. Trains must carry millions of men across enormous distances. Every timetable matters. Every delay compounds. Yet Russian leaders believe speed is essential. If Germany finishes mobilizing first, it could strike with devastating force. Germany, watching Russian troop movements, interprets mobilization as an act of war. Its own plans, especially the strategy for a two-front war, are rigid. German planners assume that if Russia mobilizes, Germany must immediately move against France in the west while holding Russia in the east. The entire structure is based on timing. If one gear shifts, the machine falters, and so the gears begin to turn. Across Eastern Europe, young men report to barracks. Farmers leave half-harvested fields. Students fold away books. Wives clutch husbands in dim railway stations, smelling of coal smoke and sweat. Bands play patriotic songs. Flags wave. Many believe the war will be short, a test of honor, a matter of weeks. In St. Petersburg, crowds cheer the Tsar. In Vienna, church bells ring. In Berlin, soldiers march through streets lined with flowers. There is fear, yes, but also exhilaration. The idea of a cleansing war, a unifying struggle, appeals to many who have never seen modern artillery tear flesh from bone. Behind the public enthusiasm lies quiet dread. Austrian officers know their army is strained by ethnic divisions. Orders must be translated into multiple languages. Loyalty cannot be assumed. Russian commanders worry about ammunition shortages and poor coordination. German leaders know they are gambling on speed. If their timetable slips, they could be crushed between east and west. Railways become arteries of fate. Steel tracks gleam under summer sun as endless trains rumble eastward. Horses stamp nervously in freight cars. Crates of rifles clatter. Coal smoke fills the sky. The sound is constant. Metal on metal, whistles piercing the dawn. On paper, mobilization is precise. In reality, it is chaotic. Men arrive without boots. Units are incomplete. Maps are outdated. Communication lines tangle. Yet once set in motion, none of it can be undone without humiliation and vulnerability. Diplomats scramble for last-minute compromises. Messages cross borders in frantic bursts of coded language. But mistrust is too deep. Each capital believes delay equals weakness. Each believes its survival is at stake. By early August, declarations of war cascade across Europe. Germany declares war on Russia. Austria-Hungary declares war on Russia. Alliances solidify like ice forming over dark water. The Eastern Front does not yet exist as a defined battlefield. It is an idea, a vast expanse from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains where millions will soon collide. No trenches scar the earth yet. No villages burn. But the collision is inevitable. Somewhere in a Russian village, a young conscript boards a train for the first time in his life, staring wide-eyed at the world rushing past. Somewhere in Galicia, an Austrian officer studies a map by lamplight, tracing possible invasion routes. Somewhere in East Prussia, a German reservist kisses his child goodbye, promising to return by Christmas. None of them know what is coming. They do not know that entire armies will vanish in forests and swamps. They do not know that winters will freeze men where they stand. They do not know that revolution will erupt behind the lines and tear empires apart from within. All they know is that the orders have come. The powder keg has ignited. And as the first Russian armies begin to move toward the borders of East Prussia and Galicia, the vast plains of the east wait, silent, heavy, and about to be drenched in blood. Chapter 2. The Russian Steamroller, Mobilization and the First Invasions, 1914. The first reports arrive in Berlin like a cold wind under a locked door. Russian armies are moving faster than anyone expected. Trains are unloading troops near the German frontier. Cavalry patrols have crossed into East Prussia. In the early days of August 1914, what German planners had feared most begins to unfold. The vast Russian Empire, slow and unwieldy on paper, is not waiting quietly in the east. It is advancing. At dawn along the East Prussian border, mist clings low to fields of rye and barley. Church bells in small villages ring as they have for generations, unaware that this morning will be different. Then the distant rumble begins, not thunder, but artillery. Russian guns open fire across a frontier that had felt secure only days before. German border guards fall back. Telegraph wires crackle. The war has truly begun in the east. For decades, Western observers had spoken of the Russian steamroller, a metaphor suggesting that once Russia mobilized its vast manpower, it would crush its enemies under sheer weight. German strategists did not fully believe it, but they respected the possibility. Russia could field millions. Even if poorly equipped, numbers alone could overwhelm thin defenses. The steamroller image lingers now in every conversation among German commanders. But a steamroller must first start moving. And to their alarm, it is already rolling. Russia's mobilization had been chaotic, but it had not been paralyzed. Under General Yakov Zelensky, two main armies are directed toward East Prussia. The First Army, under General Paul von Rennenkampf, advances from the northeast. The Second Army, commanded by General Alexander Samsonov, pushes from the south. The plan is simple in concept. Like two hands clapping shut, they will converge and crush the smaller German Eighth Army between them. On the ground, however, simplicity dissolves. Russian soldiers march for days through dust and heat. Boots blister. Supply wagons creak under heavy loads. Some units carry modern rifles. Others rely on outdated models. Ammunition is rationed carefully. Yet morale, at least in these early days, is surprisingly high. Many soldiers believe they are marching to defend Slavic honor, to humble Germany, to protect Serbia. Priests bless regiments. Icons are carried at the head of columns. The air smells of sweat, leather, and hot metal. Across the frontier in East Prussia, civilians flee with what they can carry. Horse-drawn carts clog narrow roads. Livestock scatter. Mothers clutch children tightly as rumors spread of Cossack raids. The memory of earlier wars with Russia lingers in local lore, tales of harsh occupation and reprisals. German authorities issue urgent instructions. Bridges are prepared for demolition. Defensive positions are hastily organized. The German Eighth Army, commanded initially by General Maximilian von Prittwitz, is small compared to the Russian forces converging upon it. Many of Germany's best troops have already been committed westward, following the rigid timetable of the Schlieffen Plan. In Berlin, the focus remains on France. But now, the eastern flank trembles. The first major clash comes at Gumbinnen in mid-August. Russian forces collide with German units in fierce fighting. Artillery thunders across open fields. Infantry charges falter under machine gun fire. The ground becomes churned mud despite the summer heat. The Russians fight stubbornly. German troops, expecting a quick repulse, are shocked by the intensity of resistance. The Battle of Gumbinnen does not bring a decisive victory for either side, but it shakes German confidence. Reports suggest that Russian forces are larger than anticipated and more aggressive. Panic begins to spread within the German command structure. General von Prittwitz briefly contemplates retreating behind the Vistula River, effectively abandoning East Prussia. The thought of yielding German soil sends alarm bells ringing in Berlin. Within days, a dramatic decision is made. Von Prittwitz is relieved. In his place, two men are summoned from retirement and staff positions: Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. Their partnership will soon become legendary, but at this moment they are simply tasked with preventing disaster. They board a train eastward, aware that failure could expose Germany's homeland to invasion. While Germany reorganizes, events in Galicia unfold with even greater violence. To the south, the Austro-Hungarian Empire launches its own offensive against Russia. Vienna hopes to strike quickly before Russian mobilization fully solidifies. But the reality is harsher than expected. Austro-Hungarian forces advance into Russian Poland and Galicia, but coordination falters. Orders are misunderstood across language barriers. Units composed of different ethnic groups struggle with communication. Russian counterattacks are fierce. Battles at Krasnik, Komarov, and Lemberg erupt in rapid succession. Artillery shells burst in orchards and wheat fields. The smell of burning timber fills the air as villages are caught in crossfire. By early September, the tide turns decisively in Galicia. Russian armies push Austro-Hungarian forces back. The city of Lemberg, today known as Lviv, falls to Russian control. Austrian units suffer staggering losses. Entire divisions disintegrate under pressure. Soldiers retreat in confusion, exhausted and demoralized. In Vienna, shock sets in. The war that was meant to be swift and punitive has become a desperate struggle for survival. The Russian advance into Galicia fuels confidence in St. Petersburg. Newspapers proclaim victories. Crowds gather in celebration. Yet behind the scenes, cracks are visible. Russian supply lines stretch thin. Rail networks struggle to keep pace with advancing armies. Ammunition stockpiles diminish faster than anticipated. Still, for the moment, momentum seems to favor the Tsar's forces. Back in East Prussia, Hindenburg and Ludendorff assess the situation with cold precision. They discover something critical. Russian armies are not coordinating effectively. Rennenkampf and Samsonov, commanding the 1st and 2nd Armies respectively, harbor personal animosity from previous conflicts. Communication between them is weak. Worse still, Russian messages are being transmitted without proper encryption. German intelligence intercepts them, revealing troop movements and intentions. The German command identifies an opportunity. Instead of retreating, they will concentrate their forces against Samsonov's 2nd Army in the south, leaving only minimal units to monitor Rennenkampf in the north. It is a gamble, a bold maneuver relying on speed and interior lines, the military principle of moving forces quickly within one's own territory to strike separate enemy columns before they unite. Imagine facing two opponents and knocking one down before the other can reach you. That is the essence of the strategy. German trains move with remarkable efficiency. Troops are shifted across East Prussia along well-maintained rail lines. Soldiers feel the vibration of steel beneath their boots as they disembark near new positions. Officers study intercepted Russian dispatches late into the night. Timing is everything. Meanwhile, Samsonov's 2nd Army advances deeper into East Prussia, believing the Germans to be in retreat. The landscape is deceptively beautiful. Rolling hills, dense forests, tranquil lakes. But beneath the calm surface, German forces are converging. As August draws to a close, the trap begins to close near the town of Tannenberg. German units strike from multiple directions. Russian columns, stretched thin and poorly coordinated, struggle to respond. Confusion spreads rapidly. Orders contradict each other. Supply wagons become stranded. Communications break down entirely. The sound of battle is relentless. Machine guns rattling, artillery crashing, wounded men crying out in fields trampled flat. German forces encircle the 2nd Army with ruthless efficiency. Entire Russian units find themselves surrounded, cut off from escape routes. Soldiers attempt desperate breakouts through forests thick with smoke and fear. General Samsonov rides through the chaos, realizing too late the scale of disaster. Tens of thousands of his men are being captured. Others are killed or scattered. In the suffocating heat of late summer, exhaustion overwhelms discipline. Food runs short. Water becomes scarce. The once confident advance turns into a nightmare of encirclement. When the battle finally ends, the scale of destruction is staggering. Approximately 90,000 Russian soldiers are taken prisoner. Thousands more lie dead. Samsonov, unable to bear the humiliation, walks into a forest and takes his own life. The Russian steamroller has been violently derailed, at least in East Prussia. In Berlin, relief sweeps through the capital. Hindenburg and Ludendorff are hailed as saviors. The myth of Tannenberg is born, a symbolic revenge for Germany's medieval defeat by Slavic forces centuries earlier. National pride surges. Yet even as Germany celebrates, the broader Eastern Front remains fluid and brutal. Rennenkampf's First Army retreats under pressure, but is not destroyed. In Galicia, Russian successes continue to threaten Austria-Hungary. The front stretches hundreds of miles, shifting constantly. Unlike the trenches forming in the west, the east is a war of movement, sweeping advances and sudden collapses. Civilians bear the weight of it all. In Galicia and East Prussia, homes are looted or abandoned. Fields are left untended. Jewish communities face suspicion and violence, accused of espionage by both sides. Refugee columns grow longer each week, trudging along muddy roads with whatever possessions they can carry. For the soldiers, the romance of war fades quickly. Letters home speak of endless marching, of comrades lost in confusion, of the deafening roar of artillery that never seems to stop. Boots rot in damp conditions. Uniforms stiffen with sweat and grime. Hunger gnaws persistently. By autumn, the initial shock of mobilization has given way to grim reality. Russia has demonstrated both strength and vulnerability. Austria-Hungary reels from heavy losses, but refuses to collapse. Germany has proven capable of rapid maneuver, but remains stretched between two fronts. The Eastern Front is no longer a distant possibility. It is a living, bleeding reality. Millions of men are now committed to a struggle that shows no sign of quick resolution. The vast plains, forests, and rivers of Eastern Europe have become a theater of unpredictable violence. And even as winter approaches, bringing with it the promise of freezing winds and impassable mud, neither side is willing to step back. The steamroller has not been destroyed. It has merely stumbled. The next blows are already being prepared. As snow begins to dust the fields of East Prussia and Galicia, commanders on both sides study their maps by lamplight, planning the next movement. They believe the coming months will determine the fate of the East. They are only partially right, because the war here is not just about territory. It is about endurance, industrial, logistical, human. And as 1914 draws toward its end, the armies dig in for a struggle far longer and bloodier than anyone imagined when the first trains began to roll. Chapter 3. Tannenberg, Germany's crushing blow. The forest is quiet now. The gunfire has faded into distant echoes. Crows circle above fields littered with rifles, torn uniforms, and abandoned artillery pieces half sunk in churned earth. In the fading light of late August 1914, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers sit in stunned silence, surrounded. Their officers are missing. Their supply wagons are gone. Their escape routes are closed. Somewhere in those woods, their commander walks alone, revolver in hand, knowing the war he believed he understood has just destroyed his army. Only days earlier, General Alexander Samsonov had marched confidently into East Prussia. The Russian Second Army advanced south of the Masurian Lakes, believing the Germans were retreating in disorder. Reports suggested that the enemy was falling back toward the Vistula River. The plan seemed straightforward: press forward, coordinate with General Rennenkampf's First Army approaching from the northeast, and crush the German Eighth Army between them. Two massive pincers closing from opposite sides, like hands clapping shut on a trapped opponent. But what Samsonov did not fully grasp was how vulnerable his own forces were becoming with every mile they advanced. The Russian Second Army was large, over 100,000 men, but it was stretched thin across rough terrain. Columns were separated by forests and lakes. Communication relied heavily on wireless transmissions, many sent without proper encryption. German intelligence operators listened carefully, scribbling down intercepted messages that revealed Russian movements in alarming detail. What for the Russians was convenience became catastrophe. Meanwhile, in the German command center at Marienburg, newly appointed commanders Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff studied maps with ruthless focus. They understood something critical. Rennenkampf and Samsonov were not coordinating effectively. The two generals had quarreled years earlier during the Russo-Japanese War. Personal resentment lingered. Their armies advanced on parallel tracks, but without tight synchronization. The space between them widened like a crack in ice. The German Eighth Army was smaller, but it had advantages: interior rail lines, disciplined coordination, and a single, unified command structure. German troops could be shifted rapidly from one sector to another by train, reinforcing threatened positions within hours rather than days. It was like fighting on a chessboard where you could slide your pieces faster than your opponent could move theirs. The decision made by Hindenburg and Ludendorff was bold to the point of audacity. They would leave a minimal force to delay Rennenkampf's First Army in the north and concentrate the bulk of their strength against Samsonov in the south. The maneuver was risky. If Rennenkampf moved quickly, he could crash into the weakened German screening force and break through. But German intelligence suggested he was advancing slowly and cautiously. The trap began to close. As August 26 dawned, German units struck the flanks of the Russian Second Army near the town of Tannenberg. The name itself carried symbolic weight for Germany, recalling a medieval defeat centuries earlier. Now, in 1914, it would be transformed into a legend of reversal. The fighting was immediate and ferocious. German artillery batteries, carefully positioned, opened devastating fire on Russian columns moving along narrow roads. Shells burst in tight formations of infantry. Horses screamed as shrapnel tore through harnesses. The air filled with acrid smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Russian soldiers, surprised by the intensity of resistance, struggled to deploy effectively in dense forest terrain. German infantry units attacked with precision, seizing key crossroads and cutting communication lines. Rail lines were secured, ensuring steady flow of reinforcements. The encirclement tightened day by day. What had seemed like a steady advance became a desperate struggle for survival. Inside the Russian ranks, confusion spread like wildfire. Orders arrived late or contradicted earlier instructions. Some units were told to advance, others to retreat. Ammunition wagons failed to reach frontline troops. Water supplies dwindled in late summer heat. Men marched for miles only to discover they were surrounded by enemy forces on multiple sides. Samsonov rode between positions, attempting to impose order. His face reportedly drawn with exhaustion. He grasped the scale of danger, but could not halt it. His army was being compressed inward, its flanks collapsing under coordinated German pressure. To the north, Rennenkampf's First Army did not move swiftly enough to relieve the encircled Second Army. Whether due to miscommunication, caution, or lingering distrust between commanders, the critical link failed to materialize. The two Russian armies, envisioned as a unified hammer, remained separated by distance and hesitation. By August 28, German forces had effectively sealed the ring. Russian troops attempted breakout assaults through forests thick with undergrowth and smoke. Some succeeded in slipping through small gaps. Many were cut down by concentrated machine gun fire. The sound was relentless. The sharp crack of rifles, the steady rattle of Maxim guns, the thunder of artillery that seemed to shake the earth itself. Entire regiments found themselves without officers. Command structures disintegrated. Some units surrendered in large groups, raising white cloths tied to rifle barrels. Others fought stubbornly until ammunition ran dry. In sweltering heat, men collapsed from exhaustion, their uniforms soaked in sweat and grime. German soldiers, too, paid a price. Assaulting entrenched positions through dense woodland was brutal. Casualties mounted on both sides. But the coordination of German movements, directed by intercepted Russian signals and executed with rail-borne reinforcements, proved decisive. As the encirclement completed, the scale of disaster became undeniable. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were trapped in a tightening pocket. Supplies were gone. Escape routes were sealed. Artillery pieces were abandoned in muddy clearings. Horses, once symbols of mobility, lay dead along forest paths. On the night of August 29, Samsonov wandered into the woods near Willenburg. Reports later suggested he was overwhelmed by shame and despair. Unable to face the Tsar after losing an entire army, he shot himself beneath the trees. His body was later recovered and buried quietly. The general's fate mirrored the collapse of his command. When the fighting finally subsided, the results stunned Europe. Approximately 90,000 Russian soldiers had been captured. Tens of thousands more were killed or wounded. The German Eighth Army, outnumbered at the outset, had destroyed a massive enemy force through coordination, intelligence, and rapid maneuver. Berlin erupted in celebration. Newspapers proclaimed a miraculous victory. Hindenburg and Ludendorff became national heroes almost overnight. The name, Tannenberg, was invoked with reverence, framed as redemption for historical grievances. The morale boost for Germany was immense, especially as brutal fighting continued in the West. But beneath the triumph lay sobering realities. The Russian First Army under Rennenkampf still operated to the northeast. Though shaken, it had not been annihilated. German forces had to pivot quickly to confront it in the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes. There, in early September, German units pushed Rennenkampf back toward the Russian frontier, inflicting heavy losses but failing to encircle him completely. The front stabilized temporarily. In Galicia, meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian situation remained dire. Russian victories in the south had not been reversed by Tannenberg. Lemberg remained under Russian control. Austrian armies were retreating in disorder toward the Carpathian Mountains. For Vienna, Tannenberg provided little immediate relief. The Eastern Front was already revealing its unique character. Unlike the trenches solidifying in France, this was a war of sweeping movements and sudden collapses. Armies advanced and retreated across vast distances measured not in yards but in hundreds of miles. Supply lines stretched thin. Weather conditions shifted dramatically from heat to mud to freezing cold. For the soldiers captured at Tannenberg, a different ordeal began. They were marched into Germany as prisoners of war, often exhausted and underfed. Many would spend years in camps, separated from families who might never learn their fate. The human cost extended far beyond the battlefield itself. Russian society absorbed the blow with a mixture of shock and denial. Official reports downplayed the scale of defeat. Yet whispers spread. Mothers waited anxiously for letters that would never arrive. Factories continued to churn out rifles and shells, but cracks in the imperial structure began to widen. The illusion of unstoppable strength had been shattered. German leaders, though emboldened, understood that one victory did not end the threat. Russia retained enormous reserves of manpower. Its industrial capacity, though strained, continued to produce. The steamroller metaphor lingered, dented, perhaps, but not destroyed. As autumn approached, rain turned roads into mud. Supply wagons bogged down. Horses struggled through sodden fields. Soldiers huddled under damp blankets, listening to the distant rumble of guns. The initial excitement of mobilization had long since faded. What remained was fatigue, uncertainty, and the growing realization that this war would not be over by Christmas. Hindenburg and Ludendorff's reputation soared. Their partnership became central to Germany's Eastern strategy. They projected confidence, projecting the image of control in a conflict increasingly defined by chaos. Yet even they could not predict how the Eastern Front would evolve over the coming years, how it would swallow entire regions, trigger revolutions, and redraw borders. In the forests around Tannenberg, the ground bore silent witness to what had happened. Shallow graves marked by rough wooden crosses dotted the landscape. Abandoned rifles lay rusting among fallen leaves. The scent of decay lingered in late summer air. The battle had lasted only days. Its consequences would echo for years. Tannenberg proved that Germany could strike decisively in the east despite commitments in the west. It exposed Russian weaknesses in coordination and communication. It boosted German morale at a critical moment, but it also hardened resolve on all sides. No one spoke now of short war. As winter winds began to whisper across East Prussia, armies regrouped and dug in where terrain demanded. New offensives were planned. Reinforcements were summoned. The Eastern Front, baptized in blood at Tannenberg, was far from finished. Because even as Germany celebrated its crushing blow, Russia was already preparing its next moves. Millions of men still stood under arms. Factories still hammered steel into shells. The vast plains had room for more armies and more slaughter, and the war in the East was only just beginning. Chapter 4. Galicia burns. Austria-Hungary on the brink. The first thing the soldiers notice is the silence after the bombardment. A strange, hollow silence broken only by the crackle of burning timber and the distant groan of wounded men. Smoke drifts low over the fields of Galicia, blurring the outlines of church spires and farmhouses. Entire regiments have vanished in the haze. Officers search for units that no longer exist. And somewhere behind the collapsing lines, generals in pressed uniforms stare at maps that no longer reflect reality. While Germany celebrates its triumph at Tannenberg, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is unraveling to the south. Galicia, a sprawling province on the empire's eastern frontier, has become the epicenter of disaster. It is a land of rolling plains and scattered villages, of Polish landlords and Ukrainian peasants, of Jewish market towns and railway junctions that now serve as arteries of war. In August 1914, it was supposed to be the staging ground for a swift Austrian offensive against Russia. Instead, it is turning into a graveyard. Vienna had entered the war confident that Serbia could be punished quickly and Russia contained long enough for Germany to secure victory in the West. The empire's leadership believed in offensive spirit, in bold movements that would disrupt Russian mobilization. But confidence collided with complexity. The Austro-Hungarian army was not a unified national force. It was a mosaic reflecting the empire itself. Orders were issued in multiple languages. Soldiers from Hungary, Bohemia, Croatia, and Galicia marched under the same banners, but with different loyalties, accents, and traditions. Some were fiercely loyal to the Habsburg crown. Others felt only distant attachment to Vienna. In peacetime, this diversity was manageable. In war, it became a vulnerability. In late August, Austrian forces advanced into Russian Poland and toward the Galician borderlands, expecting to meet scattered resistance. Instead, they encountered determined Russian armies moving westward in force. Battles erupted at Krasnik and Komarov. At first, the Austrians achieved limited success, pushing Russian units back in localized engagements. But the tide shifted rapidly. Russian reinforcements poured into Galicia, their columns stretching across dusty roads for miles. Despite setbacks in East Prussia, Russia retained immense manpower in the south. Commanders there were less shaken by Tannenberg. They pressed forward with grim determination. The fighting intensified around Lemberg, Galicia's capital. Artillery thundered day and night. The ground shook beneath sustained barrages. Smoke hung in the air so thick that men coughed as they advanced. Trenches were dug hastily, then abandoned just as quickly when flanking maneuvers threatened encirclement. Unlike the static lines forming in France, the eastern battlefield remained fluid, armies maneuvering across vast distances, colliding, retreating, and reforming. Austrian units began to falter under sustained pressure. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Entire brigades were shattered in frontal assaults against entrenched Russian positions. Officers reported men exhausted, confused, struggling to understand rapidly changing orders shouted in unfamiliar tongues. In one village near the front, Peasants watched as columns of retreating Austrian soldiers passed through, uniforms torn, faces hollow with shock. Some soldiers threw away equipment to lighten their load. Others staggered forward in stunned silence. The smell of sweat, gunpowder, and fear clung to them like a second skin. The Russian advance was relentless. By early September, Lemberg fell. Russian troops marched into the city under fluttering banners. Church bells rang, not in celebration, but in uncertainty. For the inhabitants of Galicia, the change of occupation brought anxiety. Jewish communities feared pogroms. Polish landowners worried about reprisals. Ukrainian villagers were caught between empires, unsure which flag offered greater safety. For Vienna, the loss of Lemberg was more than a military setback. It was a symbolic blow. Galicia was part of the empire's eastern identity, a buffer zone against Russian expansion. Its fall exposed deeper weaknesses. The scale of Austrian casualties was staggering. Hundreds of thousands were killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of weeks. Entire formations ceased to function as cohesive units. Reports from the front described artillery batteries abandoned for lack of horses, supply trains stranded on muddy roads, wounded men left behind during chaotic retreats. Inside the Imperial Command, recriminations began quietly. Field commanders blamed poor intelligence. Staff officers blamed logistical failures. Some whispered about the structural problem. An army built from multiple nationalities fighting a modern industrial war without unified identity. Russian forces pressed further westward, driving Austrian armies toward the Carpathian Mountains. The terrain shifted from open plains to rugged highlands. Autumn rains turned roads into thick, sucking mud. Wagons bogged down. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Men trudged through knee-deep sludge, boots soaked, uniforms heavy with grime. The sensory experience of Galicia in 1914 was overwhelming. The constant boom of artillery reverberated through valleys. Smoke obscured sunrises. The stench of unburied bodies lingered in fields where battles had raged. Rain mixed with blood to create dark rivulets along rutted paths. For soldiers on both sides, survival became a daily struggle. Russian infantry, though buoyed by victories, faced their own hardships. Supply lines stretched thin across expanding fronts. Ammunition shortages began to appear. Food rations grew irregular. Yet momentum remained on their side. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, by contrast, teetered. In Vienna, officials attempted to maintain public confidence. Newspapers downplayed losses. Patriotic rhetoric filled columns. But letters from the front told a different story, of shattered units, of confusion, of despair. Behind the lines, refugees flooded westward. Families abandoned farms and villages ahead of advancing Russian troops. Carts creaked under the weight of hastily packed belongings. Children cried from hunger and fear. Alongside them marched columns of prisoners of war. Austrians captured in the opening weeks, escorted eastward into Russian territory. In some occupied areas, Russian authorities imposed strict controls. Suspected collaborators were detained. In certain regions, Jewish communities were accused of aiding the enemy and subjected to harassment or violence. Ethnic tensions flared, exacerbated by fear and suspicion. Galicia became not only a military battleground, but a social tinderbox. As September gave way to October, the Austro-Hungarian High Command faced a grim reality. Without German assistance, the empire might collapse entirely on the Eastern Front. Appeals were made to Berlin for reinforcement. Germany, though heavily engaged in the West, could not afford the disintegration of its ally. Plans were drafted to send troops southward. The Eastern War, initially considered secondary, demanded renewed attention. Meanwhile, the Carpathian Mountains loomed as the next line of defense. Austrian forces attempted to regroup along these natural barriers. Trenches were carved into rocky slopes. Barbed wire was strung across narrow passes. Winter approached, threatening to freeze both armies into immobility. The Carpathian Campaign would soon become one of the most brutal episodes of the early war. But even before snow fell, exhaustion had set in. Soldiers dug shallow foxholes with numb hands. Rations were stretched thin. Frost crept into boots at night. The Russian advance into Galicia had achieved significant territorial gains, but at enormous cost. Casualties on both sides reached into the hundreds of thousands within months. The Eastern Theater was already consuming men at a rate few had imagined. Inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, cracks widened beyond the battlefield. Economic strain intensified. Factories struggled to meet military demands. Food shortages began to appear in urban centers. Ethnic tensions, previously contained, flared as news of defeats spread. Yet despite the catastrophe, the empire did not break. Habsburg officers rallied remaining units. Reinforcements were mobilized from interior regions. German divisions began moving southward to stabilize the front. The Austro-Hungarian army, battered but not destroyed, prepared for renewed resistance. In the villages of Galicia, the war's impact lingered visibly. Burned farmhouses stood blackened against gray skies. Fields lay untended, crops rotting in place. Livestock wandered unattended. The civilian population bore scars that would not fade quickly. For the soldiers who survived those first months, illusions were gone. The war was not a swift, punitive expedition. It was a grinding struggle across vast distances, demanding endurance beyond imagination. The fall of Lemberg and the collapse in Galicia had exposed Austria-Hungary's vulnerability. The empire stood on the brink, not yet fallen, but shaken to its core. German assistance would be essential. Without it, the Eastern Front might swallow the Habsburg monarchy whole. As winter winds began to whisper down from the mountains, both armies braced for what lay ahead. The ground, soaked with autumn rain, would soon harden under frost. Snow would blanket the fields where so many had fallen. And in Vienna, amid flickering candlelight and urgent telegrams, a realization took hold. The war in the East was not a supporting act to events in France. It was a decisive struggle of its own, one that could determine whether empires survived or vanished. Galicia burned in 1914, but the flames had not yet reached their highest point, because the next phase of the war would bring not only further bloodshed, but deeper desperation, and the realization that this Eastern inferno was far from contained. Chapter 5, 1915, The Great Retreat. The ground trembles before the soldiers even see the shells. A low, rolling thunder builds across the horizon, not from a passing storm, but from hundreds of guns firing in synchronized fury. The sky over the small Galician town of Gorlice flashes white and orange, again and again, until the earth itself seems to split open. Russian trenches collapse in clouds of dust and splintered timber. Telephone wires snap. Runners are cut down before they can carry orders. And in those opening hours of May 1915, the Eastern Front shifts violently and will not stop shifting for months. By the spring of 1915, the war in the East has settled into a grinding stalemate across vast, unstable lines. Russia still occupies much of Galicia, including Lemberg. Austro-Hungarian forces, though battered in 1914, have stabilized their positions with German assistance. But both sides are exhausted. Ammunition shortages plague the Russian army. Rifles are scarce. In some units, recruits drill without weapons, waiting for rifles to be taken from fallen comrades at the front. German leaders, particularly Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, understand something crucial. Russia's greatest strength, its manpower, is also its weakness if its supply system collapses. The Russian rail network is thin, stretched over immense distances. Its industrial base cannot keep pace with the demands of modern artillery warfare. If struck hard enough, the entire Russian front might fracture. Thus, in May 1915, Germany and Austria-Hungary launch a massive offensive near Gorlice and Tarnow. It is not merely another attack. It is a concentrated, methodical hammer blow designed to smash the Russian line open. The artillery preparation alone is overwhelming. German heavy guns, including massive siege artillery previously used in Belgium, pound Russian positions for hours without pause. Shells tear through trenches, uproot barbed wire, and ignite ammunition dumps. The air fills with choking dust and acrid smoke. Russian soldiers, huddled in shallow dugouts, feel the earth convulse beneath them. Some clutch religious icons. Others simply wait, stunned by the intensity. When the bombardment lifts, German and Austro-Hungarian infantry surge forward in coordinated waves. They advance not blindly, but with carefully mapped objectives, targeting weak points identified by reconnaissance. Russian defenses, already strained by shortages of shells and rifles, begin to crumble. The breakthrough comes quickly. Russian units retreat in disorder. Entire regiments withdraw to avoid encirclement. Supply wagons clog narrow roads as officers attempt to re-establish coherent lines. But the scale of the assault is too great. What begins as a tactical withdrawal becomes something far larger. The Great Retreat has begun. Across hundreds of miles of front, Russian armies pull back, not in days, but in weeks and months. Galicia is abandoned. Limburg falls once more to Austro-Hungarian forces. Russian troops burn bridges behind them. Rail lines are destroyed. Warehouses are set ablaze to prevent supplies from falling into enemy hands. The retreat is not orderly. It is desperate. Columns of soldiers march eastward under relentless pressure. Boots were thin. Rations dwindle. Artillery pieces are abandoned when horses collapse. The smell of sweat and smoke hangs constantly in the air. Dust coats faces until every man appears carved from the same gray earth. Civilians are caught in the storm. Russian authorities, fearing that local populations might collaborate with advancing Central Powers forces, begin forced evacuations. Entire communities are uprooted. Jewish families, in particular, are accused of disloyalty and driven from their homes. Pogroms erupt in some areas, fueled by paranoia and fear. Villages burn, sometimes by advancing armies, sometimes by retreating ones implementing scorched earth policies. The Great Retreat becomes not just a military movement, but a humanitarian catastrophe. Long lines of refugees stretch along roads toward the Russian interior. Mothers carry infants wrapped in blankets. Old men limp beside carts piled high with furniture and sacks of grain. Children cry from hunger. Livestock wander unattended, lowing in confusion. The sound of artillery remains constant in the distance, a reminder that safety is always temporary. For Russian soldiers, morale plummets. They are not merely retreating. They are being pushed back relentlessly by a coordinated enemy with superior artillery and better logistics. Ammunition shortages become acute. In some sectors, infantry units are ordered to hold positions with only a handful of shells remaining for their guns. Machine guns overheat from continuous fire. Officers struggle to maintain discipline. Desertions increase. Rumors spread that the government in Petrograd does not understand the suffering at the front. Letters home speak of exhaustion, of hunger, of endless marching with no clear objective. The geography of the Eastern Front magnifies everything. Unlike the tight trench networks of France, here distances are vast. Retreating units must traverse open plains, forests, rivers, and swamps. Roads are primitive, often little more than dirt tracks. Summer heat turns fields into choking dust. Autumn rains transform them into seas of mud. The Central Powers advance steadily, but they too face challenges. Supply lines lengthen with each mile gained. German commanders must balance ambition with practicality. Ludendorff pushes for decisive encirclements, hoping to trap entire Russian armies as at Tannenberg. But Russian forces, though battered, managed to withdraw before being fully surrounded. In Warsaw, anxiety mounts. The city, a major industrial and rail hub, lies directly in the path of the advancing German armies. Russian authorities debate whether to defend it to the last man or withdraw to preserve forces. Ultimately, pragmatism prevails. In August 1915, Russian troops evacuate Warsaw, blowing up bridges across the Vistula River behind them. German forces march into the city amid silent streets. The fall of Warsaw is a psychological blow to Russia and a triumph for Germany. Newspapers in Berlin proclaim the capture as proof of superiority. Yet the Russian army, though forced back, remains intact. Further north, the Baltic provinces face similar upheaval. Lithuanian and Latvian towns change hands. Civilian populations flee or endure occupation under strict military governance. German authorities establish administrative structures in newly captured territories, but resistance and resentment simmer beneath the surface. By late summer, the Russian front has shifted dramatically eastward. Poland, Lithuania, and much of Galicia are lost. The map of Eastern Europe is redrawn in weeks. Yet the Russian army, though humiliated, has avoided annihilation. It has retreated deep into its own territory, shortening its lines and drawing closer to interior supply centers. In Petrograd, political pressure intensifies. Critics accuse the government of incompetence. The Duma, Russia's parliament, grows increasingly vocal. Tsar Nicholas II faces a fateful decision, one that will alter the trajectory of the empire. In September 1915, Nicholas assumes personal command of the Russian armed forces. It is a symbolic act intended to rally morale, but it ties the monarchy directly to the army's failures. Every defeat from this point forward will reflect on the Tsar personally. At the front, soldiers hear the Tsar's decision with mixed reactions. Some are encouraged by the notion of imperial leadership. Others view it with skepticism. What they need is ammunition, boots, and food, not distant symbolism. Autumn arrives with cold winds and relentless rain. Retreating Russian forces dig new defensive positions along the line from Riga through Pinsk to the Romanian border. Trenches are carved into sodden earth. Barbed wire is strung hastily across muddy fields. Artillery batteries reposition behind rivers and marshes. The Great Retreat slows as the Central Power's momentum wanes. German supply lines stretch dangerously thin. Horses die from exhaustion. Railways struggle to keep pace with advancing armies. The offensive that began with thunder at Gorlice now grinds into logistical limits. Yet the cost has been immense. Millions of soldiers have marched hundreds of miles. Casualties on all sides reach staggering levels. Civilian displacement numbers in the millions. Entire regions of Eastern Europe lie devastated, their infrastructure shattered, their populations traumatized. For the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the offensive brings temporary relief. Territories lost in 1914 are largely regained. Confidence rises in Vienna, but the empire's structural weaknesses remain unresolved. Ethnic tensions persist. Economic strain deepens. For Germany, the campaign demonstrates its capacity for coordinated, large-scale operations in the East. But it also reinforces a strategic dilemma. Victory in the East does not end the war. The Western Front still demands enormous resources. The two-front struggle continues. And for Russia, the Great Retreat leaves scars that run deeper than territorial loss. It exposes systemic flaws in military organization and industrial capacity. It accelerates political discontent. It strains the bond between ruler and ruled. In the forests and fields left behind, remnants of battle remain. Broken wagons, rusting rifles, shallow graves marked by crude crosses, smoke-blackened villages where only chimneys stand. Winter approaches once more. Snow begins to fall over abandoned Polish towns. Refugees huddle in makeshift shelters. Soldiers wrap themselves in thin blankets, staring eastward toward lines that have stabilized. For now, the Great Retreat has ended in geography, but not in consequence. Russia has survived, but barely. The Eastern Front remains vast and volatile. The Central Powers have advanced deep into enemy territory, yet decisive victory eludes them. And as 1915 draws toward its close, a new question hangs over the frozen plains. How long can Russia endure this strain before something far more dangerous than military defeat begins to unfold within its own borders? The steamroller has not crushed its enemies, But it has not been destroyed either. It is wounded. It is angry. And beneath the surface of retreat and resilience, pressures are building that will soon erupt in ways no general can control. Chapter 6. Total War in the East. The first snow falls silently over a battlefield that no longer resembles a battlefield at all. Trenches have collapsed into muddy trenches of ice. Broken wagons lie half-buried. Frozen bodies sit upright against trees, rifles still clutched in stiff fingers. The guns are quiet for the moment, but the war has not paused. It has simply changed shape. By the winter of 1915 and 1916, the Eastern Front is no longer just a contest of armies. It is becoming something larger, darker, a war against entire societies. In the West, the war has hardened into trench lines that barely move. In the East, there is no neat division between front and rear. The lines are fluid, shifting, sprawling across thousands of miles. Villages are occupied, abandoned, reoccupied. Civilian populations find themselves under one flag one month and another the next. And wherever armies move, they bring not only rifles and artillery, but policies, suspicion, hunger, and fear. The Russian Empire, reeling from the Great Retreat, faces a crisis that cannot be solved by soldiers alone. Factories in Petrograd and Moscow strain to produce shells and rifles, but production cannot keep pace with the demands of modern industrial war. Railroads are clogged with military shipments. Civilian goods sit stranded. Coal shortages slow trains. The empire's vast distances, once a shield against invasion, now become a logistical nightmare. Total war means every aspect of life bends toward survival. Farmers are ordered to supply grain at fixed prices. Industrial workers labor for long hours in freezing factories. Women take positions in munitions plants, their hands raw from handling metal casings. The smell of oil and hot steel fills the air of industrial districts, even as bread lines grow longer outside. At the front, soldiers feel the strain immediately. Boots wear through and cannot be replaced. Winter coats are scarce. Artillery units ration shells carefully, firing only when necessary. In some sectors, soldiers are told to hold positions without adequate ammunition. The phrase shell hunger becomes common. Not an emotional hunger, but a literal shortage that leaves units vulnerable. On the Austro-Hungarian side, strain is equally severe. The empire's economy, already fragile, struggles under prolonged mobilization. Food prices rise. Ethnic tensions intensify as different groups accuse each other of hoarding or favoritism. In Budapest and Vienna, civilian morale wavers. Letters from the front describe horrific conditions, and the initial patriotic enthusiasm of 1914 has long since evaporated. In Galicia and Poland, civilians endure a different nightmare. The shifting front leaves destruction in its wake. Houses are requisitioned for troops. Livestock is seized. Fields are trampled by marching columns. Markets collapse as trade routes disintegrate. Disease spreads in overcrowded towns where refugees seek shelter. One of the darkest aspects of total war in the East is the systematic deportation of populations deemed unreliable. Russian authorities, retreating in 1915, forcibly remove hundreds of thousands of civilians from border regions. Jews, Germans, Poles, and others are accused of collaborating with the enemy. Entire communities are ordered to pack what they can carry and march eastward. The deportations are chaotic and brutal. Families are separated. Elderly people collapse along frozen roads. Children cry from hunger. Guards shout orders in harsh tones. The sound of boots crunching on snow accompanies endless columns of displaced people. Camps are hastily erected in interior provinces, but supplies are insufficient. Disease spreads rapidly in cramped conditions. For Jewish communities in particular, suspicion becomes deadly. Both Russian and Austro-Hungarian forces harbor deep mistrust. Pogroms flare in some regions, fueled by rumor and military panic. Homes are looted. Synagogues are vandalized. Fear becomes a constant companion. Prisoners of war represent another vast human tide. By 1916, millions of soldiers from both sides are held in captivity. Russian prisoners are marched into Germany and Austria, where they labor in fields and factories. Austro-Hungarian prisoners are transported deep into Russia, sometimes to remote Siberian camps. Life in these camps is harsh, but varies widely. Some prisoners are treated according to international conventions, receiving parcels and limited communication with home. Others endure severe shortages of food and medical care. The war stretches on, and captivity becomes not a temporary condition, but a prolonged existence measured in years. The Eastern Front also witnesses the militarization of occupation. In newly captured territories, German authorities establish administrative zones under strict military control. Railways are seized. Resources are extracted to support the war effort. Civilian populations must carry passes to travel between towns. The presence of armed patrols becomes routine. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, though regaining some territories in 1915, remains fragile. Its army depends increasingly on German assistance. German officers oversee joint operations. German supplies bolster weakened units. The balance of power within the alliance shifts subtly but unmistakably. On the Russian side, morale deteriorates steadily. Soldiers complain of incompetent leadership and poor equipment. Letters home describe hunger, lice infestations, and endless mud. Trenches in the east are often less elaborate than those in France, but conditions are no less miserable. Water seeps into dugouts. Rats scurry through supplies. The smell of damp earth and unwashed bodies hangs heavy. The emotional toll is immense. Many soldiers have believed in a swift victory. Now they face years of uncertainty. Some cling to faith. Others grow cynical. Desertion becomes more common, especially in rear areas where discipline is weaker. Yet amid the hardship, the war continues to escalate. Industrial output increases across all combatant nations. New weapons are introduced. Heavy artillery becomes even more dominant. Airplanes, still primitive, conduct reconnaissance missions over vast expanses of territory. Cavalry units, once symbols of mobility, find themselves increasingly vulnerable to machine guns and barbed wire. The Carpathian Mountains become a theater of particular brutality. Winter fighting in high altitudes tests human endurance to its limits. Snowdrifts swallow entire trenches. Frostbite claims fingers and toes. Avalanches bury patrols alive. Soldiers describe nights so cold that rifles freeze to their hands. Breath turns instantly to ice in beards and mustaches. In these mountain battles, thousands die not from bullets, but from exposure. The war has become not only man against man, but man against nature. Back in Petrograd, political unrest simmers. Food shortages grow more severe. Rail congestion prevents grain from reaching cities. Bread queues stretch for blocks in bitter cold. Women stand for hours hoping for rations. Anger rises quietly but steadily. Tsar Nicholas, now personally commanding the army, remains distant from the capital. His decision ties the monarchy's fate directly to military performance. Each setback undermines confidence further. Meanwhile, in the royal court, rumors swirl about the influence of Grigory Rasputin, whose proximity to the imperial family fuels public suspicion and resentment. The concept of total war means there is no separation between battlefield and home front. A failure of the front reverberates in factories and kitchens. A shortage in a factory weakens soldiers at the line. The entire system is interconnected and increasingly strained. By early 1916, both sides prepare for renewed offensives. The front has stabilized somewhat, but neither coalition believes in a defensive war of attrition alone. Russia seeks a decisive blow that might relieve pressure and restore prestige. Austria-Hungary hopes to regain momentum and prevent further internal disintegration. In this environment, soldiers sense that something is building. The quiet stretches between artillery barges feel heavier. Commanders study maps with renewed intensity. Reinforcements move toward key sectors. But the underlying truth is clear. The Eastern Front has consumed millions and devastated entire regions. yet has not produced a decisive victory. Instead, it has transformed societies, hardened hatreds, and deepened suffering. Total war in the East is not merely about trenches and offensives. It is about the mobilization of entire populations, the uprooting of communities, the redefinition of citizenship and loyalty. It is about empires fighting not only external enemies, but internal fractures. As winter gives way to spring once more, the snow melts to reveal the scars beneath, cratered fields, shattered villages, and shallow graves. The war shows no sign of ending. And somewhere along the line stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, Russian commanders prepare an offensive that will attempt to reverse the tide, one that will briefly shake Austria-Hungary to its core. But even that thunderous effort will not erase the deeper truth that has taken hold across the Eastern Front. This is a war without clear boundaries, without simple victories, without mercy. It is a war that has seeped into every home, every field, every factory. And the strain is beginning to fracture the foundations of empires themselves. Chapter 7. Romania enters the Inferno, 1916. The church bells in Bucharest ring wildly as crowds flood the streets, waving flags, shouting promises of glory. It is late August 1916, and Romania has just declared war. Young men cheer beneath balconies draped in tricolor banners. Officers ride through the capital in crisp uniforms. There is talk of destiny, of reclaiming lost lands in Transylvania, of uniting all Romanians under one crown. In the electric heat of that summer evening, few imagine that within months the capital itself will fall, and the dream will dissolve into retreat, occupation, and ruin. For nearly 2 years Romania had watched the war from the sidelines. Though formally allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, its leaders hesitated, calculating which side would offer greater rewards. The key prize was Transylvania, a region of mountains and valleys inhabited by ethnic Romanians, but ruled by Hungary within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The promise of national unity burned fiercely in Bucharest political circles. Throughout 1915 and early 1916, Romanian diplomats negotiated cautiously with both alliances. The Allies, Russia, France, and Britain, promised territorial gains if Romania joined their cause. Austria-Hungary, struggling on multiple fronts, could not offer the same. As Russian forces prepared new offensives in Galicia, Romanian leaders believed the moment had come. Austria seemed weakened. Germany was locked in brutal battles at Verdun and the Somme. The time they thought was ripe. When Romania finally declared war on Austria-Hungary in late August 1916, its armies moved swiftly into Transylvania. Columns marched through the Carpathian passes, advancing into towns where some local populations greeted them with cautious optimism. Romanian soldiers believed they were liberators, reclaiming ancestral land. The mountains echoed with the tramp of boots and the clatter of artillery wheels on narrow roads. At first, resistance was limited. Austro-Hungarian forces in the region were thin and stretched. Romanian troops captured several towns with little opposition. The air was filled with confidence. Newspapers proclaimed early successes. King Ferdinand addressed the nation, invoking unity and sacrifice. But war on the Eastern Front rarely followed optimistic scripts. In Berlin and Vienna, Romania's entry into the war triggered urgent deliberations. The Central Powers could not afford a new front destabilizing their southeastern flank. German leadership acted quickly. Reinforcements were assembled under experienced commanders. Among them was General Erich von Falkenhayn, recently removed from command on the Western Front, and Field Marshal August von Mackensen, a veteran of earlier Eastern campaigns. Their strategy was calculated and ruthless. Rather than merely defending Transylvania, they planned a coordinated counteroffensive from multiple directions. German and Austro-Hungarian forces would strike through the mountain passes from the north, while Mackensen's army advanced from Bulgaria in the south, crossing the Danube into Romania proper. It was a pincer movement, similar in concept to earlier encirclements on the Eastern Front, designed to trap Romanian forces deep inside enemy territory. By September, the momentum shifted abruptly. German troops reinforced Transylvanian defenses and began pushing Romanian units back through the mountains. Fighting in the Carpathians was brutal. Steep slopes limited maneuverability. Narrow passes became killing grounds where artillery shells echoed against stone cliffs. Rain turned mountain paths into treacherous mudslides. Soldiers clung to rocky outcrops under machine gun fire, the air thin and cold at high altitudes. Romanian forces, though courageous, were not prepared for sustained modern warfare against well-equipped German divisions. Their artillery was outdated in many cases. Supplies were inconsistent. Communication faltered across rugged terrain. As Central Powers reinforcements poured in, Romanian lines wavered. Then came Mackinson's thrust from the south. Crossing the Danube with remarkable speed, German, Bulgarian, and Ottoman units advanced into the Dobruja region. The sudden southern assault caught Romanian command off guard. Two fronts now threatened simultaneously: pressure from the north in Transylvania and a deep penetration from the south toward the capital. The effect was destabilizing. Romanian units were forced to redeploy hastily, weakening already stretched defenses. Confusion spread among commanders. Orders changed rapidly. Railways became congested as troops and civilians attempted to move in opposite directions. The smell of smoke and oil hung over railway stations as trains loaded with wounded soldiers pulled away toward Bucharest. Russian forces attempted to assist their new ally, sending reinforcements to bolster the Romanian front. But coordination between Russian and Romanian commands proved difficult. Language barriers, differing doctrines, and logistical challenges hampered joint operations. Russian troops, themselves strained by previous campaigns, could not reverse the tide alone. In October, the Central Powers intensified their offensive. Falkenhayn's forces pressed through mountain passes with disciplined precision. Mackinson's army advanced steadily northward, cutting rail lines and isolating Romanian units. Artillery barges softened defensive positions before infantry assaults surged forward. Romanian soldiers fought fiercely in many engagements, particularly along the Alt River and near the town of Targagio. Trenches were dug hastily along riverbanks. Machine gun nests were established in forests. The sound of artillery rolled across valleys like distant thunder, but superior coordination and firepower gradually overwhelmed the defenders. Civilians again found themselves trapped in the crossfire. Villages in the path of advancing armies were abandoned. Families fled with what they could carry: blankets, icons, sacks of grain. Livestock scattered across fields. The autumn air smelled of smoke from burning barns and shattered farmhouses. By November 1916, the Central Powers' advance threatened Bucharest itself. Panic gripped the capital. Government officials debated evacuation plans. Archives were packed hurriedly. Foreign diplomats prepared to leave. The once celebratory streets grew tense and silent. On December 6th, German troops entered Bucharest. The fall of the Romanian capital was swift and decisive. Central Powers' forces marched through broad avenues once filled with cheering crowds. The tricolor flags that had flown proudly months earlier were gone. In their place came occupation banners and military patrols. For Romania, the campaign was catastrophic. Nearly two-thirds of the country fell under enemy control. Its oil fields, vital for fueling modern armies, were seized or sabotaged to prevent exploitation. Wheat fields and railways came under German administration. The nation's military, though not destroyed, retreated toward the Moldavian region in the northeast, where it would regroup with Russian assistance. The occupation of Bucharest had strategic implications far beyond Romanian borders. Germany gained access to valuable resources, including oil and grain, which bolstered its war effort at a critical time. Austria-Hungary received much-needed relief from pressure in Transylvania. The Central Powers stabilized their southeastern flank. But victory carried its own burdens. German forces now had to administer vast occupied territories, stretching supply lines further and requiring manpower for garrison duties. The Romanian campaign, though successful, consumed resources that might have been used elsewhere. And while Romania's initial entry into the war had been overconfident, its resistance in Moldavia would continue into the following year. In the Romanian countryside under occupation, daily life changed abruptly. German authorities imposed strict controls on movement and production. Food requisitions were enforced. Civilians endured shortages. Resistance networks formed quietly in some areas, though open rebellion was rare under heavy military presence. For Romanian soldiers who escaped the initial collapse, retreat became a test of endurance. Winter arrived early and harshly in the northeast. Trenches in Moldavia filled with icy water. Supplies were scarce. Russian reinforcements helped stabilize the line, but morale was fragile. The emotional impact on Romania was profound. What had begun as a national crusade for unity had turned into occupation and hardship within months. Families were divided by front lines. Communication between occupied and unoccupied regions was severed. The dream of rapid unification faded into grim survival. For Russia, Romania's entry and subsequent collapse added complexity to an already strained front. Russian troops were now tied to defending Moldavia while facing ongoing pressure elsewhere. The Eastern Front grew even longer, even more demanding. By the close of 1916, the Romanian campaign had reshaped the southeastern theater of the war. It demonstrated once again the volatility of the Eastern Front, how quickly fortunes could reverse, how fragile alliances could be under the weight of modern industrial warfare. The church bells that had rung in celebration months earlier were silent now. In their place came the steady rhythm of occupation boots on cobblestone streets, the distant rumble of trains carrying resources westward, and the quiet determination of a battered nation refusing to disappear. And as winter tightened its grip over the Carpathians and the Danube plains, a new storm was gathering further north, an offensive that would briefly shake Austria-Hungary to its core and send shockwaves through every capital in Europe. Romania had entered the inferno, seeking glory. Instead, it found devastation. But the Eastern Front was far from finished. Because in the frozen trenches stretching across Galicia and beyond, a Russian general was preparing an assault that would unleash thunder once more and remind the world that the war in the East still had the power to change everything. Chapter 8. Brusilov's Thunder, 1916. The guns begin before dawn, not in one place, but everywhere. Along a front stretching for hundreds of miles, the earth erupts at once. Austrian trenches vanish beneath walls of flame. Command posts collapse. Telephone lines snap in 100 sectors simultaneously. Officers stumble from dugouts in disbelief. This is not a localized assault. This is something far larger. And in those opening hours of June 1916, the Eastern Front shakes with a force that threatens to tear an empire apart. For months, Russia has endured humiliation. The Great Retreat of 1915 stripped it of Poland, Lithuania, and Galicia. Morale sank. Factories struggled. Ammunition ran short. Tsar Nicholas II assumed personal command, tying the monarchy's fate directly to the army's fortunes. The empire stands battered, but not broken. Amid this fragile stability emerges General Alexei Brusilov. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Brusilov is thoughtful, pragmatic, and keenly aware of the war's realities. He understands that traditional, concentrated offensives, where artillery pounds a narrow sector for days before infantry charges in predictable waves, have repeatedly failed, especially against entrenched defenses. He believes something different is needed, something unexpected. The Russian High Command plans a general offensive in the summer of 1916 to relieve pressure on Allied forces in the West and to support operations in Italy. Brusilov commands the southwestern front in Galicia. He requests permission to attack across a broad front rather than at a single focal point. His proposal is unconventional and risky. Instead of concentrating forces in one massive thrust, Brusilov plans multiple simultaneous assaults across a wide arc. The idea is simple but powerful. If every sector is threatened, the enemy cannot reinforce one weak point effectively. It is like tapping a glass in several places at once until it shatters. He also reforms preparation methods. Russian sappers quietly dig forward trenches closer to Austrian lines, minimizing the distance infantry must cross under fire. Artillery fire is carefully mapped and precisely timed rather than prolonged indiscriminately. Surprise becomes central. Brusilov does not want to warn the enemy with days of bombardment. He wants shock. In the early hours of June 4th, 1916, the plan unfolds. The artillery barrage is sudden and devastating. Austrian positions, unprepared for such coordinated fury across so many sectors, crumble. Wire entanglements are shredded. Defensive strongpoints collapse. In some areas, Russian infantry surges forward within hours, advancing through gaps before Austrian commanders fully comprehend the scale of attack. The impact is immediate and catastrophic for Austria-Hungary. Entire Austro-Hungarian units disintegrate. Some surrender en masse, stunned by the speed of Russian penetration. Others attempt desperate counterattacks, but are overwhelmed by coordinated Russian assaults emerging from multiple directions. Communication falters. Reports from the front conflict wildly. In Vienna, the scale of disaster becomes clear within days. The terrain of Galicia once again becomes a battlefield of chaos. Wheat fields flatten under artillery fire. Villages ignite. Rivers run red with mud and blood. The smell of burning timber and cordite fills the summer air. Brusilov's innovation lies not only in tactical surprise but in operational depth. Russian forces do not pause after the first breach. They press forward relentlessly, exploiting weaknesses before reserves can be mobilized. Cavalry units, often sidelined in trench warfare, find opportunities to move through shattered lines, disrupting supply routes and rear positions. Austro-Hungarian morale collapses rapidly. The Empire's army, already strained by earlier defeats, struggles to maintain cohesion. Ethnic tensions resurface under stress. Some Slavic units fight bravely. Others hesitate or surrender in large numbers. Officers report men discarding weapons and retreating without orders. The numbers are staggering. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of Austro-Hungarian soldiers are killed, wounded, or captured. Russian advances reclaim much of the territory lost during the Great Retreat. Town after town falls. Lemberg, once lost, is threatened again. For Russia, Brusilov's thunder feels like redemption. In Petrograd, newspapers proclaim victory. Crowds gather to celebrate renewed hope. Allied leaders in Paris and London praise the offensive as a vital contribution to the broader war effort. For a moment, the Russian Empire appears resurgent. But beneath the triumph lies strain. The offensive consumes enormous resources. Artillery shells are expended at astonishing rates. Reinforcements are rushed to the front, stretching supply lines thin. The Russian industrial base, already under pressure, struggles to sustain the tempo. Germany cannot ignore the unfolding crisis. To prevent Austria-Hungary from collapsing entirely, German High Command diverts divisions from other fronts to stabilize the situation. Reinforcements arrive with disciplined precision. German units plug gaps in Austrian lines, reinforcing key sectors. The partnership within the Central Powers shifts further, with Germany increasingly assuming leadership in the East. The battlefield dynamic evolves rapidly. Initial Russian breakthroughs slow as German resistance stiffens. Defensive positions are reorganized. Counterattacks are launched to regain lost ground. The thunder of Brusilov's opening assault gives way to grinding attrition. Yet the damage to Austria-Hungary is profound. Casualties mount into the millions over the course of the campaign. Entire divisions are shattered beyond recovery. The Empire's manpower pool, already strained, is severely depleted. Morale in Vienna and Budapest sinks to new lows. The idea that the Habsburg monarchy might not survive the war becomes more than whispered speculation. For soldiers on the ground, The offensive is both exhilarating and horrifying. Russian infantry, advancing through breached lines, encounter scenes of devastation. Trenches are littered with bodies. Abandoned equipment lies scattered. The stench of decay lingers in summer heat. Some units advance miles and days, a rare experience in a war often defined by stalemate. But the cost is visible in every regiment. Casualty lists grow long. Medical stations overflow. Wounded men lie on stretchers beneath makeshift canvas shelters, flies buzzing in thick air. Surgeons work tirelessly, hand-stained red. The Carpathian foothills once again echo with gunfire. Villages that had barely recovered from earlier campaigns are destroyed anew. Civilians flee in waves, unsure which army will occupy their homes next. The constant shifting of lines makes stability impossible. Romania, observing the offensive, sees an opportunity. The apparent collapse of Austro-Hungarian defenses encourages Romanian leaders to join the war later that summer, believing the Central Powers weakened beyond repair. Brusilov's thunder indirectly draws Romania into the inferno, a decision that will soon prove disastrous. By late summer, the momentum of the offensive slows. German reinforcements stabilize key sectors. Russian advances become more costly and less decisive. The element of surprise fades. Enemy defenses adapt. The broad front strategy, so effective initially, cannot sustain infinite breakthroughs. Still, the offensive remains one of the most successful Allied operations of the entire war. Austria-Hungary loses over 1 million men through death, injury, or capture. Its army emerges deeply scarred. German reliance intensifies. Political leaders within the empire confront grim realities about survival. Yet Russia pays heavily as well. The offensive drains manpower and ammunition. Casualties are severe. The Russian army, though victorious in many engagements, feels the strain of prolonged combat. The industrial and logistical weaknesses that plagued earlier campaigns remain unresolved. Back in Petrograd, celebrations gradually give way to renewed anxiety. Bread shortages persist. Strikes erupt intermittently in factories. Soldiers returning on leave speak candidly about hardships at the front. The gap between official optimism and lived reality widens. The Brusilov Offensive demonstrates both the potential and the limits of Russian power. It proves that innovation and coordination can yield dramatic results. It shakes the Central Powers profoundly, but it does not deliver decisive victory. As autumn approaches, rain returns to Galicia. Fields churn into mud. Artillery fire becomes more sporadic. The thunder that began in June fades into intermittent rumble. For Austria-Hungary, survival now depends almost entirely on German support. The empire's internal tensions deepen under the weight of casualties and economic strain. For Germany, the Eastern theater demands increasing attention, complicating strategy in the West. And for Russia, the paradox becomes clear. It has achieved its greatest military success of the war. Yet the very effort required to produce that success accelerates the exhaustion of its system. The soldiers have proven their courage. The commanders have demonstrated innovation. But the empire itself is fraying. In the trenches along the Eastern Front, men sense something changing. The war feels heavier. The optimism sparked by Brusilov's thunder does not erase years of hardship. Winter will come again. Supplies remain uncertain. Political murmurs grow louder behind the lines. The offensive of 1916 has altered the strategic landscape. It has shattered illusions of Austrian resilience. It has emboldened allies. It has drawn new nations into the conflict. But it has also pushed the Russian Empire closer to a breaking point. Because victories on the battlefield cannot feed cities, repair railways, or silence growing discontent at home. And as the guns fall quieter in Galicia, a different kind of storm gathers in Petrograd. One that will not be answered with artillery, but with revolution. The thunder of Brusilov has shaken the earth. The tremors are only beginning to reach the capital. Chapter 9. The home front collapses. The line outside the bakery stretches around the block before dawn. Women stamp their feet against the frozen pavement, shawls pulled tight against the biting wind. Their breath turns white in the dim blue light of early morning. They have been here for hours, waiting for bread that may never arrive. Somewhere far to the west, artillery thunders across fields and forests. But here in Petrograd, the sound that matters most is the whisper that spreads from person to person in the queue. There will not be enough. By the winter of 1916 and 1917, the war in the East has moved beyond trenches and offensives. It has seeped into kitchens, factories, rail yards, and barracks. The Eastern Front may stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea, but the heart of the crisis now beats in the cities of the Russian Empire. For 2 years, Russia has endured staggering losses. Millions of men are under arms. Millions more have been killed, wounded, or captured. Brusilov's thunder brought temporary triumph, but it also consumed vast resources. The army still stands, but the empire behind it is straining to support the weight of total war. The railways are the first to falter. Russia's rail network, never dense enough for a country of its size, is overwhelmed by military demands. Trains carry troops and ammunition to the front, leaving little capacity for civilian goods. Coal shortages reduce locomotive efficiency. Tracks freeze and crack in winter temperatures that plunge far below zero. Freight cars sit stall for days, then weeks. Grain exists in the countryside. Peasants have harvested crops, but grain cannot reach the cities in sufficient quantities. It piles up in rural depots while urban populations grow desperate. The disconnect is maddening. Food within the empire, hunger in the capital. Factory workers labor under harsh conditions. Shifts stretch longer. Wages lag behind rising prices. Inflation eats away at earnings. In munitions plants, sparks fly as shells are forged. The smell of oil and hot metal fills the air. Workers' hands blister and bleed. Some faint from exhaustion. Yet the war demands more. Strikes begin to ripple through industrial districts. At first, they're limited and focused on wages or food supplies. But gradually, the grievances deepen. Workers speak not only of bread, but of fairness, of dignity, of a government that seems distant and unresponsive. The Duma, Russia's parliament, voices criticism, urging reform and more effective administration. Tsar Nicholas II, at army headquarters far from Petrograd, dismisses much of it as noise. His decision to assume personal command in 1915 now binds him to every military setback and every logistical failure. While he remains at the front, daily governance falls increasingly under the influence of the Empress Alexandra and her controversial advisor, Grigory Rasputin. Rumors swirl through the capital. Rumors of corruption, incompetence, betrayal. Whether exaggerated or not, they erode public confidence. In the trenches, soldiers hear fragments of these stories through letters from home. They read about bread lines and factory unrest. They know that their families struggle while they freeze in muddy dugouts. The connection between front and home tightens like a knot. Winter on the Eastern Front is merciless. Temperatures plunge. Snow blankets trenches. Rifles jam from cold. Frostbite claims fingers and toes. Soldiers wrap rags around their feet when boots wear through. Food arrives irregularly. In some sectors, rations consist of thin soup and coarse bread. The smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies lingers constantly. Morale deteriorates. Some soldiers remain loyal, driven by duty or faith. Others grow bitter. They question why the war continues. They remember the Great Retreat, the heavy casualties, the endless offensives that yielded temporary gains, but no peace. Desertion becomes more frequent, particularly among newly drafted peasants who feel little attachment to the imperial cause. Officers sense the shift in mood. Discipline becomes harder to enforce. Commands that once would have been followed instantly now meet hesitation. The chain of authority frays subtly at first, then more visibly. Back in Petrograd, the winter of 1917 becomes a breaking point. Fuel shortages compound the crisis. Without sufficient coal, heating systems falter. Apartments grow cold. Factories close temporarily due to lack of supplies, sending more workers into the streets. The sound of hammering and machinery, once constant, fades in some districts. On International Women's Day, in late February by the Russian calendar, women textile workers leave their factories and march for bread. Their protest is spontaneous, born of hunger and frustration. They are joined by other workers. The crowd grows rapidly. Slogans evolve from demands for bread to calls for peace and political change. Police attempt to disperse demonstrators. Some clashes occur, but the movement spreads beyond control. Over the following days, strikes engulf the city. Tram lines stop running. Factories shut down. The capital's normal rhythm collapses. Soldiers are ordered to restore order. Regiments deploy into the streets of Petrograd. They face crowds of unarmed civilians, women, workers, students. Officers shout commands. In some cases, troops fire warning shots. In others, they hesitate. The soldiers themselves are exhausted, hungry, aware that their own families stand in similar breadlines. Then something extraordinary happens. In several key regiments, soldiers refuse orders to fire. Some units mutiny outright, turning their rifles against commanding officers or joining the demonstrators. The discipline that underpins imperial authority begins to crumble in full view of the city. The Duma attempts to intervene, forming a provisional committee to restore stability. Simultaneously, workers and soldiers establish soviets, councils representing grassroots power. Dual authority emerges almost overnight. At army headquarters, Tsar Nicholas receives fragmented reports. Trains are delayed by snow and unrest. Communication falters. He orders loyal units to suppress the uprising, but loyalty itself is uncertain. As unrest spreads, railway workers refuse to move certain trains. Telegraph lines hum with conflicting messages. The empire, vast and unwieldy, struggles to respond coherently. Within days, the situation becomes irreversible. Nicholas attempts to return to Petrograd, but finds routes blocked by mutinous troops and frozen rails. Advisors urge him to abdicate to preserve some semblance of stability. On March 2nd, 1917, aboard a train halted in the countryside, he signs the document relinquishing the throne. The Romanov dynasty, which has ruled Russia for over 3 centuries, ends not with a battlefield defeat, but with a pen stroke in a railcar. News of abdication spreads rapidly. In Petrograd, crowds cheer. Red flags appear alongside tricolor banners. Political prisoners are released. The provisional government forms, pledging reforms and civil liberties. At the front, soldiers absorb the news with disbelief. Some celebrate. Others feel uncertainty. The war continues, but the authority commanding it has changed fundamentally. The provisional government faces an immediate dilemma: continue the war alongside the Allies or seek peace. Many leaders believe Russia must honor its commitments. They fear that a separate peace would isolate the nation diplomatically and invite territorial losses. But the army is exhausted. Desertions accelerate. Soldiers form committees to debate orders. Authority becomes decentralized. Discipline erodes further. In villages across Russia, peasants hear of revolution and interpret it as license to act. Land seizures begin in some regions. Estates are occupied. The social fabric of the empire strains under rapid transformation. The collapse of the home front is not a single event. It is a cascade. Economic breakdown leads to hunger. Hunger leads to protest. Protest leads to mutiny. Mutiny leads to abdication. Each link connects directly to the pressures of total war. On the Eastern Front, the implications are profound. Command structures falter as political uncertainty spreads into military ranks. Soldiers question the purpose of continued fighting. Officers struggle to maintain cohesion. The provisional government's decision to continue the war only deepens tension between civilian leaders and frontline troops. The smell of smoke and cordite still drifts across battlefields in Galicia and beyond. But now another scent, that of political upheaval, fills the air in the rear. Germany watches carefully. The collapse of the Tsarist regime offers opportunity. If Russia descends further into chaos, the Eastern Front may dissolve without the need for massive offensives. German strategists consider how to exploit instability, including facilitating the return of exiled revolutionaries to Russia. Inside Petrograd, political factions compete for influence. Liberals, socialists, and radicals debate the future of the nation. Soviets gain increasing authority among workers and soldiers. The provisional government struggles to assert control while promising democratic reforms. For ordinary people, life remains difficult. Bread is still scarce. Fuel remains limited. War continues. The home front has not simply weakened. It has fractured. The soldiers at the front sense the tremors. Letters from home speak not of loyalty and sacrifice, but of revolution and uncertainty. The idea of fighting for Tsar and empire fades. In its place arises confusion, and in some hearts, hope for peace at any cost. As spring arrives in 1917, snow melts along the trenches. Mud returns. New offensives are discussed in government chambers. But something fundamental has changed. The war is no longer merely between empires. It is now entangled with revolution. The home front has collapsed, and with it the unquestioned authority that sustained Russia's war effort. And as the provisional government prepares to prove its legitimacy through renewed military action, the soldiers at the front, weary, skeptical, and increasingly politicized, wait to see whether they will be asked to bleed once more. The guns still fire along the Eastern Front, but behind them, an empire has fallen. And the next chapter will test whether the new rulers of Russia can command an army that no longer believes in the old world that sent it to war. Chapter 10. The Kerensky Offensive and the Army's Collapse. The whistles blow at dawn, thin and uncertain against the heavy summer air. Russian soldiers climb from their trenches, boots sinking in a churned mud, rifles slung loosely over shoulders. Some move forward because they are ordered to. Others move because the men beside them do. A few do not move at all. They remain seated on the fire step, staring blankly across no man's land, as if daring history to make them care again. It is July 1917, and what was meant to restore Russia's honor will instead expose how deeply the army has already fallen apart. For months earlier, the Tsar abdicated. The provisional government took power promising reform, liberty, and a new political future. Yet one promise remained unchanged. Russia would continue the war. To withdraw, leaders argued, would dishonor alliances and invite foreign domination. France and Britain depended on Russian pressure in the east to relieve their own battered fronts. Alexander Kerensky, the charismatic and ambitious minister of war, believes the army can still fight. He travels to the front, addressing troops with fiery speeches about democracy and duty. He stands on makeshift platforms near the trenches, sleeves rolled up, voice ringing out over restless ranks. He speaks not as an autocrat, but as a citizen among citizens. He promises glory, a new Russia forged in sacrifice. For a brief moment, some soldiers respond. Bands play, banners wave, units cheer. It feels like 1914 again, but thinner, more fragile. Beneath the applause lies exhaustion. The Russian army in 1917 is no longer the force it once was. The February Revolution has transformed its internal structure. Soldiers' committees have formed in units across the front. Officers can no longer issue orders without scrutiny. Discipline, once rigid, is now negotiated. In theory, this democratization empowers troops. In practice, it undermines cohesion. Desertions have soared into the hundreds of thousands. Many men simply walk away from the front, heading home to villages where land redistribution rumors swirl. Those who remain are often reluctant, weary of years of hardship, and unclear about what they are fighting for. Yet the offensive is planned. The target is Galicia once again, the same region that saw Brusilov's thunder the previous year. The provisional government hopes to replicate that success, to prove that revolutionary Russia can fight as effectively as Imperial Russia. General Alexei Brusilov himself supports the plan, though he privately worries about the army's readiness. Artillery preparations begin in late June. The guns still roar with impressive force. Shells arc through the sky, exploding in Austrian trenches. The smell of cordite fills the air. Smoke rises in thick columns. On paper, it resembles previous offensives. But something is different. When infantry units advance, the momentum falters almost immediately. In some sectors, soldiers refuse to leave trenches. In others, they advance hesitantly, stopping to debate orders. The synchronized shock that characterized Brusilov's offensive is absent. Initial gains are modest. Russian troops capture a few villages and advance several miles in certain sectors. Reports sent back to Petrograd emphasize these successes. Newspapers trumpet progress. Kerensky, eager for victory, praises the troops publicly. Then the cracks widen. Austro-Hungarian forces, though weakened from previous campaigns, regroup quickly with German assistance. German divisions arrive to stiffen defenses. Counter-barges strike Russian positions with punishing accuracy. Machine gun nests cut down advancing infantry. Russian soldiers, facing heavy resistance, begin to falter. Units that had advanced lose cohesion under counterattack. Some soldiers retreat without orders. Others remain in captured positions, but refuse to press further. Communication breaks down as officers struggle to enforce commands. In one sector, an entire regiment reportedly votes against continuing the assault. The language of revolution, rights, equality, representation, now collides with the brutal demands of war. By mid-July, the offensive stalls. Then comes the counterstroke. German and Austro-Hungarian forces launch a coordinated counteroffensive. Their artillery pounds Russian lines relentlessly. Infantry pushes forward into positions that are thinly held. Where once Russian troops surged westward, now they scramble eastward. The retreat that follows is chaotic. Unlike the organized withdrawal of the Great Retreat in 1915, this collapse feels less controlled. Soldiers abandon trenches rapidly. Equipment is left behind. Supply depots fall intact into enemy hands. Columns clog roads once again, but this time morale is lower, discipline weaker. The sensory experience is overwhelming. Summer heat intensifies the stench of bodies and burning wood. Flies swarm around the wounded. Horses collapse from exhaustion. Civilians along the front line pack belongings in haste, fearing another wave of occupation. Kerensky travels to the front, attempting to rally troops personally. He delivers passionate speeches, imploring soldiers to defend the revolution. Some listen respectfully. Others stare past him, eyes hollow. The rhetoric of liberty cannot erase years of suffering. Desertion becomes an avalanche. Thousands of soldiers abandon positions daily. Some simply walk home in small groups. Others commandeer trains. Railway stations become scenes of chaos as men in uniform mingle with civilians, uncertain where authority lies. The provisional government attempts to restore discipline by reinstating harsher penalties, including the death penalty at the front. But enforcement is inconsistent. Officers hesitate to execute men who were hailed as heroes of revolution months earlier. In Petrograd, political tensions intensify. Radical elements argue that the war must end immediately. Demonstrations erupt again in July, the July Days, as workers and soldiers demand greater power for the Soviets. The provisional government suppresses the unrest, but its legitimacy weakens further. At the front, German forces exploit Russian disintegration with precision. They advance steadily, recapturing much of the ground gained earlier in the year. The Eastern Front shifts once more eastward. The Romanian sector, stabilized earlier with Russian support, becomes vulnerable as Russian units withdraw. Romanian forces brace nervously, aware that their survival depends heavily on Russian cooperation. The emotional toll on soldiers is immense. Many feel betrayed, first by imperial leadership, now by revolutionary promises that have not delivered peace or stability. Letters home express cynicism. Some men speak openly of refusing further orders. Others cling to hope that political change will soon bring an end to fighting. By late summer 1917, the Russian army exists in name, but not in spirit. It still fields millions of men, but unity is gone. Authority is contested at every level. Officers are sometimes removed by soldiers' committees. Orders are debated rather than obeyed. The collapse has strategic consequences. Germany recognizes that the Eastern Front is nearing paralysis. If Russia withdraws from the war entirely, German divisions could be transferred westward, dramatically altering the balance against France and Britain. Plans begin to form for exploiting Russian instability further. Inside Russia, political radicalization accelerates. Vladimir Lenin, returned from exile earlier in the year with German assistance, calls for immediate peace and all power to the Soviets. His message resonates increasingly with war-weary soldiers and workers. The Kerensky Offensive, intended to unify the nation, has done the opposite. It has exposed the army's fragility and deepened political divisions. As autumn approaches, the front quiets not because of negotiated peace, but because effective offensive action is nearly impossible. Units exist in a state of semi-discipline. Some trenches are barely manned. In certain areas, Russian and German soldiers even fraternize cautiously across lines, sharing cigarettes and rumors of impending change. The provisional government attempts to maintain authority, but it stands on fragile ground. Economic hardship persists. Food shortages continue. Strikes reemerge. Confidence erodes daily. In the villages, returning deserters bring stories of chaos. They carry rifles slung casually over shoulders, symbols of both authority and instability. Peasants seize land more aggressively, believing the old order is gone for good. The army's collapse is not a sudden explosion. It is a gradual unraveling accelerated by failed offensives and unmet expectations. By October 1917, the situation in Petrograd reaches a boiling point. Bolshevik forces prepare to seize power, capitalizing on disillusionment with the provisional government's inability to end the war. At the front, soldiers sense that something decisive is imminent, but not another offensive. Instead, a political storm is gathering that may end Russia's participation in the conflict altogether. The whistles that sounded in July now echo faintly in memory. The attempt to restore honor through force has instead hastened the breakdown of military structure. The Kerensky Offensive stands as a final gasp of imperial-style warfare under a revolutionary banner. It proved that enthusiasm cannot substitute for cohesion, that political transformation without strategic clarity can be fatal in war. As leaves fall across the trenches and nights grow colder, the Eastern Front awaits a new chapter, not of artillery thunder, but of political revolution. Because the army that marched forward in July is no longer capable of sustaining the fight. And within weeks, power in Russia will change hands once more. This time with consequences that will reverberate far beyond the Eastern Front itself. Chapter 11, October. Revolution on the Eastern Front. The guns are still firing when the news reaches the trenches. It travels not by official dispatch, but by rumor, whispered from dugout to dugout, carried by railway workers, scribbled on leaflets stuffed into coat pockets. Petrograd has fallen, they say. The provisional government is gone. The Winter Palace has been taken. Power now belongs to the Soviets. Some soldiers laugh in disbelief. Others cross themselves. A few simply stare at the muddy ground between their boots, too tired to react. It is October 1917, and the war on the Eastern Front is about to be overtaken by something even more explosive. For months, Russia has teetered between war and revolution. The Kerensky Offensive shattered what remained of military cohesion. Desertions accelerated. Soldiers' committees questioned orders openly. The provisional government's authority faded with each failed attempt to restore discipline. Meanwhile, in Petrograd, the Bolsheviks prepare. Led by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, they promise what many Russians crave most: peace. Not victory, not honor. Peace. Peace, land, and bread becomes more than a slogan. It is a lifeline for soldiers who have spent years in freezing trenches and for workers who stand in endless food lines. On the night of November 7th by the Western calendar, October 25th by the Russian calendar, armed Bolshevik units seize key points in Petrograd. Bridges, telegraph offices, railway stations fall under their control with minimal resistance. The provisional government collapses almost without a fight. The revolution in the capital is swift and relatively bloodless, but its impact on the Eastern Front is seismic. In frontline trenches stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathians, soldiers learn that the government they served is gone. The authority that ordered them into offensives no longer exists. A new regime declares its intention to end the war immediately. For many soldiers, the reaction is relief. Some cheer openly. Others remove insignia from uniforms. The sense of endless obligation evaporates overnight. Letters home speak of hope that they may soon return to their villages. But peace is not immediate. Germany and Austria-Hungary still occupy vast swaths of former Russian territory. Millions of armed men face each other across trenches. Armistice requires negotiation, and negotiation requires stability. The Russian army, however, is barely functioning as an army anymore. Units remain in position, but discipline is tenuous. Soldiers debate whether to continue fighting until formal agreements are signed. Officers, many of whom distrust the Bolsheviks, struggle to maintain authority. Some resign. Others attempt to cooperate with soldiers' committees to prevent complete collapse. In certain sectors, informal truces emerge spontaneously. Russian and German soldiers wave white cloths and approach cautiously across no man's land. They exchange cigarettes, bread, and rumors. The air, once filled constantly with artillery thunder, grows quieter. The sensory landscape shifts. Instead of the crack of rifles, there is murmured conversation. Instead of relentless shell fire, there is the rustle of winter wind across frozen fields. The smell of smoke lingers, but it is no longer joined by the fresh burst of cordite every hour. German commanders observe carefully. They recognize the opportunity. If Russia withdraws fully, divisions tied down in the east can be transferred westward for a decisive push against France and Britain before American forces arrive in full strength. Negotiations begin in the fortress town of Brest-Litovsk in December 1917. Russian representatives, led by Trotsky, arrive determined to secure peace without territorial humiliation. They argue for a settlement without annexations or indemnities. The German delegation, however, negotiates from a position of strength. They control Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, much of Belarus, and Ukraine. While diplomats debate, the situation at the front continues to unravel. Some Russian units begin withdrawing independently, ignoring orders to hold positions. Trenches are abandoned without ceremony. Equipment is left behind. In certain regions, entire formations dissolve as soldiers head home with rifles slung casually over shoulders. The railway system, already strained, becomes chaotic. Trains are overcrowded with demobilizing soldiers. Stations overflow with men seeking passage eastward. Authority at transit points is inconsistent. Revolutionary committees attempt to maintain order, but resources are scarce. In villages along the front, civilians experience a strange calm punctuated by uncertainty. The armies that dominated their lives for years now stand idle or drift away. Yet the future remains unclear. Will the Germans advance further? Will peace hold? Inside Russia, the Bolsheviks consolidate power. They disband the old officer corps gradually, replacing traditional command structures with politically reliable commissars. The concept of a revolutionary army begins to take shape, one built on ideological commitment rather than imperial hierarchy. But at this moment, late 1917, the front exists in limbo. German troops remain disciplined and organized. They maintain defensive positions, awaiting formal outcomes. Austrian units, weakened from years of war, also hold lines, but with less enthusiasm. The Central Powers understand that Russian disintegration offers strategic advantage, but they proceed cautiously during negotiations. Trotsky attempts a bold tactic, declaring that Russia will cease fighting but refuse to sign a humiliating treaty. He announces a policy of neither war nor peace, hoping revolutionary fervor will spread into Germany and Austria-Hungary, forcing a more favorable settlement. The gamble fails. In February 1918, frustrated by delays, German forces resume offensive operations along the Eastern Front. The advance is swift and largely unopposed. Russian units, already demobilizing, cannot mount meaningful resistance. Cities fall with minimal fighting. The speed of German progress shocks even seasoned commanders. Petrograd itself feels threatened. Faced with renewed invasion, the Bolshevik leadership relocates the capital to Moscow for security. Panic rises briefly as German forces approach dangerously close. The reality becomes undeniable. Without a functioning army, Russia cannot dictate terms. In March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed. Its terms are harsh. Russia cedes vast territories: Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, and parts of Belarus and the Caucasus. Millions of people fall under German or Austro-Hungarian control. The empire that once stretched confidently westward now contracts dramatically. For many Russians, the treaty feels like betrayal. For others, it is a necessary price for peace. Soldiers at the front hear of the agreement and begin returning home in larger numbers. The Eastern Front, as it existed since 1914, effectively dissolves. But peace does not bring stability. Within Russia, civil war erupts between Bolshevik forces and various anti-Bolshevik factions. The Whites, regional nationalists, foreign interventionists. The rifles carried home from the trenches are soon used again, this time against fellow Russians. For Germany, the temporary victory in the east offers strategic relief. Divisions are redeployed westward in preparation for a final offensive in France. The resources extracted from Ukraine and other occupied regions bolster the Central Powers' strained economy. Yet the peace is fragile and temporary. By late 1918, Germany itself faces collapse on the Western Front and internal revolution. The territories gained through Brest-Litovsk will not remain under German control for long. On the former Eastern Front, the physical scars remain. Trenches slowly fill with snow and debris. Barbed wire rusts. Artillery pieces lie abandoned in frozen fields. The silence is unsettling, not because peace is permanent, but because the noise of empire has been replaced by the uncertainty of revolution. The October Revolution did not end violence in the East. It transformed it. The war between empires gave way to ideological struggle. The old hierarchies dissolved. Soldiers who once fought for Tsar and empire now fought for red banners or white ones. For the men who endured the trenches since 1914, the shift was dizzying. They had marched under imperial flags, retreated in chaos, attacked in thunderous offensives, and watched their government collapse. Now they faced a future defined not by foreign invasion, but by internal conflict. The Eastern Front, as a conventional theater of the Great War, was over. But the human cost lingered. Millions dead, millions displaced, entire regions devastated, borders redrawn, dynasties extinguished. The revolution that began in Petrograd had reached the trenches and unraveled an empire's war effort from within. And as Europe moved toward the final year of global conflict, the vacuum left by Russia's withdrawal would reshape strategies, redraw maps, and sow seeds for future upheavals that would echo long after the guns of 1914 fell silent. The guns on the Eastern Front had quieted, but the tremors of revolution were only just beginning to shake the world. Chapter 12, Brest-Litovsk, a harsh peace. The hall is cold, cavernous, and heavy with tension. Uniformed German officers stand stiffly beneath dim chandeliers inside the fortress of Brest-Litovsk. Across from them sit the representatives of a revolution, men who have toppled a centuries-old dynasty, now forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. The war in the East has not ended with triumph or reconciliation. It has ended here, at a long wooden table, under the shadow of defeat. And what is about to be signed will redraw the map of Eastern Europe with a ruthless pen. By early 1918, Russia is no longer an empire in the old sense. The Bolsheviks have seized power in Petrograd and relocated the capital to Moscow. Their promise to the Russian people was clear: peace at any cost. But as German troops resumed their advance in February, pushing rapidly through abandoned lines and capturing cities with alarming speed, it becomes obvious that any cost may be far higher than anticipated. The Russian army, shattered by revolution and demobilization, cannot resist. Units that once fielded hundreds of thousands now dissolve at the first sign of German advance. Trains overloaded with deserters clog rail lines. Villages along the path of the offensive see soldiers in gray uniforms march through without meaningful opposition. It is not a battle. It is a demonstration of power. The Bolshevik leadership faces an impossible choice. On one side stands ideology, the belief that revolution will spread across Europe, that German workers will rise in solidarity, forcing their government to accept a just peace. On the other stands reality, German divisions advancing toward Petrograd with disciplined precision, threatening the fragile revolutionary state itself. Leon Trotsky, head of the Soviet delegation, attempts a bold maneuver. He declares that Russia will cease fighting, but refuses to sign a humiliating treaty. Neither war nor peace, he proclaims, hoping delay will spark upheaval within Germany. Instead, the German High Command responds with force. In mid-February 1918, Operation Vorschlag begins, a lightning advance across the Eastern Front. German troops move by rail and on foot, capturing vast territories almost unopposed. The speed is astonishing. Cities fall in days. Resistance is minimal. The psychological impact on Moscow is immediate and profound. Panic spreads through Bolshevik ranks. Petrograd feels vulnerable. Lenin argues that survival of the revolution is paramount. Territorial losses, he insists, can be reversed later. Without peace, the revolution may collapse entirely. And so the delegation returns to Brest-Litovsk. The negotiations are stark and uncompromising. Germany demands recognition of independence for Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Ukraine, territories effectively under its control. Poland is severed. Belarus is partitioned. Russia is required to demobilize much of its remaining military forces. The scale of territorial loss is immense. Russia forfeits nearly one-third of its population, significant portions of its agricultural land, and much of its industrial capacity. Coal mines, grain fields, and rail networks fall outside its new borders. For a nation already strained, the economic implications are devastating. On March 3, 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed. The pen strokes are quiet. There is no artillery barrage, no cavalry charge. Yet the consequences echo louder than any gun. For the Central Powers, the treaty appears to be a triumph. Germany secures access to Ukraine's grain, a potential solution to food shortages at home. It establishes a sphere of influence across Eastern Europe, envisioning a chain of satellite states that would extend German power deep into the continent. Austria-Hungary gains temporary stability along its eastern frontier. In Berlin, leaders celebrate what they see as a masterstroke of strategy. With Russia removed from the war, dozens of divisions can now be transferred westward. A final offensive against France and Britain becomes feasible before American forces arrive in overwhelming numbers. But beneath the surface of victory lies fragility. Administering the vast territories gained through Brest-Litovsk requires manpower and resources. German troops must occupy cities, guard railways, and oversee local governments. Resistance movements begin forming quietly. Nationalist aspirations in the Baltic and Ukrainian regions complicate German plans for smooth control. In Ukraine, German forces support a new regime intended to guarantee grain deliveries. But rural unrest grows. Peasants resent requisitions. The countryside remains unstable. What was meant to be an orderly economic arrangement becomes increasingly chaotic. For Russia, the treaty is humiliating but transformative. The Bolsheviks consolidate power in the core territories that remain. The Red Army begins to form under Trotsky's direction, built not on imperial loyalty, but on ideological commitment and strict discipline. Former officers are compelled to serve under watchful commissars. The seeds of civil war germinate quickly. Across the former Eastern Front, the landscape shifts from international war to internal conflict. White armies rise in opposition to Bolshevik rule. Foreign intervention forces from Britain, France, Japan, and the United States land in various ports, hoping to prevent German exploitation or to suppress Bolshevism. The rifles that once faced German trenches are now turned inward. In the Baltic states, power vacuums create instability. Local nationalists push for independence. German authorities attempt to shape governments favorable to Berlin. The region becomes a patchwork of competing claims and shifting allegiances. Poland, long partitioned among empires, senses opportunity. National leaders move toward re-establishing an independent state. The collapse of Russian imperial authority and the weakening of Germany later in 1918 will make that dream reality. The treaty reshapes the human geography of Eastern Europe. Millions find themselves living under new administrations overnight. Ethnic tensions flare. Borders drawn in fortress halls fail to account for complex demographics on the ground. Railways and trade networks that once functioned under imperial systems now cross unstable frontiers. In villages along the former front lines, the silence is unsettling. Trenches remain carved into the earth. Barbed wire rusts. The smell of decay lingers where bodies were hastily buried. Civilians return cautiously to damaged homes, unsure which flag will ultimately fly overhead. For soldiers demobilized from the Russian army, the journey home is bittersweet. They are no longer required to fight Germans, but many will soon be drawn into civil war. Hunger persists. Economic dislocation continues. Peace has ended one conflict but opened another. Back in Germany, optimism from Brest-Litovsk fuels ambitious plans for the Western Front. Divisions freed from the east are redeployed for a massive spring offensive in France. The High Command believes the moment for decisive victory has arrived. Yet time is not on Germany's side. The American Expeditionary Force grows steadily in strength. Allied morale stabilizes. Germany's own population suffers from blockade-induced shortages. The apparent triumph in the East masks deepening strain at home. By late 1918, the German gamble fails. The Western Front collapses under combined Allied offensives. Internal unrest spreads through German cities. Sailors mutiny in Kiel. Workers strike. The Kaiser abdicates. Armistice is signed in November. With Germany defeated, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is effectively nullified. The territories carved away from Russia are once again contested. New states emerge in the Baltic region and Poland. Ukraine becomes a battleground in the Russian Civil War. The map drawn in March 1918 dissolves under the pressure of broader collapse. The harsh peace at Brest-Litovsk becomes a fleeting episode in the larger saga of upheaval. Yet its impact lingers. It accelerates the formation of independent nations in Eastern Europe. It deepens resentment and instability. It demonstrates how war's end can be as destabilizing as its beginning. For the Eastern Front itself, Brest-Litovsk marks both conclusion and transformation. The imperial war between Russia and the Central Powers is over. But violence has not vanished. It has merely changed direction. The Fortress Hall in Brest-Litovsk stands quiet after the delegations depart. The chandeliers no longer illuminate tense negotiations. Dust settles slowly in the aftermath of decisions that reshaped continents. The soldiers who once filled trenches across Galicia and Poland now scatter across a fractured landscape. Some join the Red Army. Some fight for white generals. Some attempt simply to survive in villages stripped bare by years of requisition and occupation. The Great War in the East has ended not with decisive battlefield victory, but with political collapse and imposed peace. And as Europe turns toward final reckoning in the West, the lands of the former Eastern Front brace for a different kind of storm. One of civil war, nationalist uprising, and redrawing of borders that will define the next generation. The guns have fallen silent along the old lines, but the peace signed at Brest-Litovsk is brittle. And in the vacuum left by empire, new conflicts are already taking shape. Chapter 13, Civil War and the Shattered East. The silence after the armistice in the East does not sound like peace. It sounds like emptiness, and then, slowly, like something far more dangerous. The trenches along the former Eastern Front no longer echo with artillery duels between empires, but rifle shots still crack in the distance. Columns of soldiers still march across frozen plains. Trains still carry armed men toward uncertain destinations. The Great War between Russia and the Central Powers has ended, but the land it devastated is about to be torn apart all over again. When the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed in March 1918, the old Eastern Front dissolved on paper. But on the ground, power fractured into competing forces. The Russian Empire had collapsed. The Tsar was gone. The provisional government had fallen. The Bolsheviks now claimed authority for Moscow. Yet much of the territory once ruled by Russia no longer answered to any single center. The war between states gave way to war within a state. In cities like Kiev, Minsk, Riga, and Vilnius, the flags changed repeatedly in a matter of months. German garrisons occupied strategic points following Brest-Litovsk, seeking to extract grain and resources. Local nationalist leaders declared independence where they could. Peasants, exhausted by years of requisition and retreat, seized land and formed their own militias. Armed groups sprang up everywhere, some organized, others little more than bands with rifles and ambition. For soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front since 1914, there was no clean demobilization. Many returned home only to find their villages caught in new struggles. Some joined the Red Army, believing in the Bolshevik promise of a new social order. Others aligned with anti-Bolshevik white forces, hoping to restore some version of the old regime or simply to prevent radical change. Still others fought for nationalist causes, Polish, Ukrainian, Baltic, seeking independence from both Germany and Russia. The geography of conflict expanded beyond any single front line. In the north, British and American troops landed at Archangel and Murmansk, officially to prevent war material from falling into German hands, unofficially to counter Bolshevism. In the south, French and Greek forces appeared in Odessa. In Siberia, Japanese and American troops disembarked at Vladivostok, drawn into a complex web of local and international interests. The Eastern Front had once been a vast but defined theater between empires. Now it was a mosaic of civil war zones stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific. The Red Army, under Leon Trotsky's organizational genius, began to take shape in 1918. Unlike the old Imperial Army, it was built from the chaos of revolution. Former Tsarist officers were pressed into service under strict political supervision. Commissars ensured loyalty to Bolshevik ideology. Discipline returned, harsh and uncompromising. Desertion was punishable by death. Units that faltered faced brutal consequences. Trotsky traveled by armored train across the fragmented landscape, moving from sector to sector, rallying troops, enforcing discipline, issuing commands with sharp clarity. The train itself became a symbol, a moving headquarters of revolution, bristling with guards and printing presses, carrying authority across the rails of a broken empire. Opposing the Reds were multiple white armies, each with different goals and limited coordination. In the south, General Anton Denikin gathered forces aiming to march north toward Moscow. In Siberia, Admiral Alexander Kolchak declared himself supreme ruler, seeking to re-establish centralized authority. In the northwest, General Nikolai Yudenik prepared to strike toward Petrograd, but the Whites faced enormous obstacles. Their political vision was often vague or unpopular. Many peasants feared a return to landowners and old hierarchies. The whites depended heavily on foreign support, which was inconsistent and politically controversial. Coordination across vast distances proved difficult in a land with shattered railways and unstable supply lines. Meanwhile, the Baltic region descended in a layered conflict. In Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, nationalist forces sought to establish independent states. German Free Corps units, volunteer paramilitary groups, operated in the region even after Germany's formal defeat in November 1918. Bolshevik forces attempted to expand influence westward. Polish units maneuvered in contested territories. The fighting was fluid and brutal. Towns changed hands repeatedly. Civilians lived under shifting authorities. The smell of smoke and damp earth remained constant. Markets reopened briefly, only to close again when new armies approached. In Ukraine, the situation was even more chaotic. Following Brest-Litovsk, Germany had supported a Ukrainian government to secure grain supplies. But after Germany's collapse in late 1918, power vacuums opened. Ukrainian nationalist forces clashed with Bolsheviks. White armies moved through the region. Peasant insurgents formed under leaders like Nestor Makhno, whose anarchist forces fought both Reds and Whites at different times. The countryside became a battlefield of overlapping loyalties. Armed horsemen rode through villages at dawn. Grain was seized repeatedly by whichever force held control that week. Jewish communities suffered terribly in pogroms carried out by various factions, leaving deep scars across the region. Further west, Poland re-emerged as an independent state in November 1918, but its borders were far from settled. Polish forces clashed with Bolsheviks in what would become the Polish-Soviet War. The old Eastern Front's terrain once again saw artillery positions and infantry advances, though under new banners. In Finland, civil war erupted in early 1918 between Reds and Whites, with German support aiding the White side. The conflict was swift but bitter, leaving divisions that would last generations. The human toll of this secondary wave of violence was staggering. Villages already damaged by Imperial War were destroyed again. Fields that had lain fallow during military campaigns remained uncultivated amid civil conflict. Refugees moved constantly, carrying stories of new atrocities. The sound of gunfire never truly ceased. It simply changed allegiance. For former soldiers of the imperial armies, identity became fluid. A man who wore the Tsar's insignia in 1914 might now wear a red star or a white armband. Allegiance often depended less on ideology than on survival, proximity, or protection for one's family. The Eastern Front's infrastructure lay in ruins. Railways, essential for moving troops and supplies, had been damaged repeatedly. Bridges blown during retreats remained unrepaired. Telegraph lines sagged. Without efficient transportation, armies relied on horses and carts, limiting mobility and intensifying hardship. Winters remained unforgiving. In 1919, snow blanketed battlefields once more. Soldiers huddled in improvised shelters, wearing mismatched uniforms scavenged from old stockpiles. Frostbite and typhus claimed thousands. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded towns with little sanitation. The Civil War was not merely a military struggle. It was ideological and social. The Bolsheviks implemented policies of war communism, requisitioning grain directly from peasants to feed cities and armies. This sparked resistance in rural areas. Rebellions flared sporadically. The line between front and rear dissolved completely. White forces promised order and a return to stability, but many failed to articulate clear land policies. Peasants who had seized estates during revolution feared losing them. As a result, rural support for white armies remained inconsistent. Foreign intervention complicated matters further. British troops in the north found themselves in a land they barely understood, fighting in brutal winter conditions against Bolshevik units. American forces, deployed reluctantly, faced similar challenges. Their presence fueled Bolshevik propaganda, portraying the conflict as a defense against foreign invasion. By 1919, the Red Army gained momentum. Trotsky's reorganization bore fruit. Coordinated offensives pushed white forces back. Kolchak's regime in Siberia collapsed. Denikin's advance toward Moscow faltered and reversed. Yudenika's attempt to seize Petrograd failed narrowly. One by one, white strongholds fell. The Civil War would continue in various forms into 1920 and beyond, but by late 1919, the balance tilted decisively toward the Bolsheviks. Across the lands once defined as the Eastern Front, new states crystallized. Finland secured independence. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, fought their wars and emerged sovereign. Poland expanded eastward after defeating Soviet forces in 1920. Ukraine's fate remained contested, but ultimately incorporated into the emerging Soviet state. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, already weakened by Brusilov's thunder and Romania's inferno, collapsed in late 1918. New nations, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, rose from its fragments. The map of Central and Eastern Europe bore little resemblance to that of 1914. The Great War in the East had begun as a clash of empires. It ended with those empires shattered, replaced by fragile republics and a revolutionary state that would soon be known as the Soviet Union. In villages across the former front, life resumed cautiously. Fields were replanted, homes rebuilt with scavenged timber. But the memory of constant war lingered in every scarred landscape. The Eastern Front did not end with a parade or a single armistice signature. It dissolved into revolution, civil war, and redrawn borders. It consumed not only armies but entire political systems. And for the millions who survived, soldiers, peasants, refugees, the line between 1914 and 1920 blurred into one long, relentless struggle. The trenches have collapsed. The barbed wire has rusted away. But the world that existed before the first shots in Sarajevo is gone forever. In its place stands a shattered East, fractured, bloodied, and reshaped by war within war. And as Europe moves toward uneasy peace in the West, the East remains restless, its wounds far from healed, its future uncertain, its memories heavy with the echo of guns that never truly fell silent. Chapter 14. Empires fall, nations rise. The imperial banners come down quietly. No cannon salute marks their lowering. No triumphant anthem plays. In Vienna, in Berlin, in Petrograd turned Moscow, the flags that once symbolized ancient dynasties are folded away as if part of a vanished ceremony. For 4 years, the Eastern Front consumed men, land, and certainty. Now, in its aftermath, the old empires that marched so confidently into war in 1914 are collapsing one by one, leaving behind a vacuum filled not with peace, but with fragile new beginnings. When the guns fall silent in November 1918 on the Western Front, the reverberations reach deep into the East. Germany, triumphant at Brest-Litovsk only months earlier, is now exhausted and broken. Blockade, hunger, and battlefield defeat push its population to the edge. Sailors mutiny in Kiel. Workers strike in Berlin. The Kaiser abdicates and flees. The empire that once dictated harsh peace terms in the East now faces its own reckoning. Austria-Hungary disintegrates even faster. For years, the Habsburg monarchy endured under immense strain. Brusilov's thunder in 1916 shattered its army's confidence. Romania's entry into the war forced desperate mobilizations. Ethnic divisions widened with every casualty list. By late 1918, nationalist movements within the empire move openly. Czechs declare independence in Prague. South Slavs proclaim a new kingdom that will become Yugoslavia. Hungary asserts its own sovereignty. The imperial court in Vienna can no longer command obedience across its sprawling domains. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a mosaic of languages and loyalties held together for centuries, dissolves in weeks. In the East, the Russian Empire has already collapsed under the weight of revolution. The Romanov dynasty ended in March 1917. Civil war rages. Bolshevik forces gradually consolidate control, but the shape of the future remains uncertain. The old imperial map, once stretching from Poland to the Pacific, is irrevocably altered. Across the former Eastern Front, something unprecedented unfolds. New nations rise from the wreckage. Poland, partitioned since the late 18th century, re-emerges as an independent state. In Warsaw, crowds gather in celebration as Józef Pilsudski assumes leadership. The city, once a contested stronghold under Russian and then German occupation, becomes the capital of a reborn republic. Yet the borders are not fixed. Fighting continues along eastern frontiers as Polish forces clash with Bolsheviks in a struggle that will define the region's future. To the north, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, carve out independence amid chaos. They fight wars against both German Free Corps units and Bolshevik forces. Their independence is hard-won, secured through winter battles fought in forests and along frozen rivers. Each village retaken carries the weight of survival. Finland, too, emerges from the shadow of empire. Its civil war in 1918 leaves deep scars, but by year's end, it stands as a sovereign nation. The boundary between Russia and Finland becomes a line drawn not by imperial decree, but by revolutionary and nationalist struggle. In the south, Romania, battered by invasion and occupation, reclaims territories and expands. Transylvania joins the Romanian kingdom, fulfilling the national dream that had drawn it into the inferno in 1916. Bucharest, once occupied by foreign troops, now celebrates unification. The Ottoman Empire, though not the focus of the Eastern Front, also fractures. In the Caucasus, Armenians, Georgians, and Azerbaijanis attempt to establish independent republics amid shifting control between Bolshevik and Turkish forces. The region becomes another arena of instability. The map of Eastern Europe, once dominated by vast imperial blocs, now resembles a patchwork quilt of emerging states. But each new border carries tension. The human cost of transformation is immense. Millions are displaced. Former imperial administrators flee. Soldiers return to villages that now belong to different nations. Languages once suppressed become official tongues. Flags change above city halls. Yet beneath symbolic change lies hardship. The war has devastated infrastructure. Railways are damaged. Bridges destroyed. Fields left fallow for years yield poor harvests. Hunger lingers. Disease spreads in overcrowded cities. In Vienna, citizens queue for bread, much as they did in Petrograd. The empire's collapse has not erased shortages. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestone streets echoes in a city stripped of its imperial grandeur. Soldiers return home to a republic they never expected to serve. In Berlin, political upheaval continues. The Weimar Republic is proclaimed amid uncertainty and resentment. Many Germans view the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, as humiliation. The loss of territory and the war guilt clause fuel anger that will smolder for years. In Moscow, the Bolsheviks consolidate control through civil war victory. By 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is proclaimed, institutionalizing the revolutionary state. The Eastern Front's collapse has not restored Russia's old borders, but it has given rise to a new ideological empire. For those who fought from 1914 onward, the changes are dizzying. A soldier who began the war under the double-headed eagle of the Tsar may have marched under a red star by its end. An Austrian infantryman who defended Galicia might now find himself a citizen of Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia. A Polish conscript once pressed into Russian service now serves in independent Poland. Identity shifts with borders. The psychological toll is profound. Years of relentless warfare blur into a single memory of mud, snow, artillery thunder, and hunger. Families mourn sons who never returned. Villages commemorate the dead with simple wooden crosses. The smell of damp earth and former trenches lingers in collective memory. The political consequences of the Eastern Front's collapse ripple outward. The principle of national self-determination, championed by leaders like Woodrow Wilson, inspires new states, but also sparks conflict where ethnic lines overlap. Minorities find themselves stranded within new borders, fueling grievances. In places like Galicia and the Balkans, tensions simmer beneath the surface of independence. Economic recovery proves slow. Former imperial markets are fragmented by new customs barriers. Trade networks must be rebuilt. Currency systems stabilize only gradually. Inflation plagues several states in the early post-war years. Yet there is also hope. In Prague, intellectuals and workers celebrate the birth of Czechoslovakia with optimism about democratic governance. In Tallinn and Riga, independence fosters cultural revival. In Warsaw, schools teach Polish history openly after generations of suppression. The fall of empires opens space for new narratives. But the scars of war remain visible. Across the plains of Poland, rusting artillery shells are unearthed by plows. In the Carpathian Mountains, abandoned fortifications crumble under snow. Along the Baltic coast, cemeteries hold rows of crosses marking soldiers from every side of the conflict. The Eastern Front, once overshadowed by the trenches of France, has reshaped the heart of Europe. For empires entered the war in 1914 confident in their strength: Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman. By 1919, all four have collapsed or been transformed beyond recognition. The causes are complex: military defeat, economic exhaustion, nationalist movements, revolutionary ideology. Each played a role. The relentless attrition of the Eastern Front drained manpower and morale. Brusilov's thunder shattered Austria-Hungary's cohesion. The Great Retreat exposed Russian weaknesses. The Kerensky Offensive accelerated collapse. Revolution overturned centuries of monarchy. Brest-Litovsk redrew borders only to see them redrawn again. The Eastern Front was not merely a secondary theater to the Western Front's trench stalemate. It was a crucible where empires disintegrated and new nations emerged. In Vienna's Schönbrunn Palace, once filled with imperial ceremony, halls stand quieter. In Berlin's former imperial court, authority rests uneasily with elected leaders. In Moscow's Kremlin, red banners replace imperial standards. The transformation is total. Yet peace is fragile. Border disputes persist. Economic instability breeds political extremism. The memory of humiliation and loss fuels resentment. In Germany, nationalist anger festers. In the Soviet Union, ideological conflict spreads. In Eastern Europe, newly drawn borders will face challenge again in less than a generation. The Eastern Front's legacy is not simply one of military campaigns. It is the collapse of an old order and the birth of a volatile new one. As 1920 approaches, the map of Europe appears settled, but beneath the surface currents of instability flow strong. The soldiers who survived return to plow fields, work in factories, or join new armies. The widows light candles for husbands lost in battles whose names now fade from memory: Tannenberg, Lemberg, Gorlice, the Carpathians. Empires fall, nations rise, but the ground they stand on is still warm from war. And as Europe attempts to heal, the lessons of the Eastern Front, about fragility, about nationalism, about revolution, linger like distant thunder on the horizon. The guns have stopped. The flags have changed. Yet the story of the Eastern Front is far from over. Because the forces unleashed between 1914 and 1918 will shape the continent's fate long after the last imperial banner is lowered. Chapter 15. The Forgotten Slaughter. There are no endless rows of preserved trenches visited by busloads of tourists. No towering white memorial arches that dominate global memory. No single battlefield in the East carries the same universal recognition as Verdun or the Somme. Instead, the Eastern Front is scattered across forests, marshes, mountains, and plains, its dead buried beneath fields that now grow wheat, beneath roads that hum with ordinary life. Yet between 1914 and 1918, more than 5 million soldiers were killed there. Millions more were wounded, captured, displaced, or lost to hunger and disease. It was not a sideshow. It was a slaughter on a continental scale. The war in the East began with confidence and calculation. Empires marched believing they understood the stakes. Russia mobilized in defense of Slavic identity and geopolitical ambition. Austria-Hungary sought to crush Serbian defiance and preserve its fragile unity. Germany prepared for a two-front war with mechanical precision. Few foresaw that the Eastern theater would not simply mirror the West, but unravel entire political systems. The landscapes themselves shaped the conflict. Unlike the relatively confined trench networks of France and Belgium, the Eastern Front stretched across nearly 1,000 miles at its height. Armies maneuvered over vast distances. Entire corps vanished into forests and reappeared miles away. Front lines shifted dramatically from season to season. Mud swallowed supply trains in autumn. Snow froze men in place during winter. Summer heat carried the smell of decay across open plains. At Tannenberg, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were encircled and captured in days. In Galicia, Austrian divisions collapsed under relentless pressure. During the Great Retreat, millions marched eastward in exhaustion. Brusilov's thunder shattered Austro-Hungarian cohesion in 1916. Romania's hopeful entry into the war ended in occupation. The Kerensky Offensive revealed a revolutionary army unable to sustain imperial warfare. Brest-Litovsk imposed a harsh peace that dissolved within months. Each campaign carried staggering losses. The Russian Empire suffered approximately 2 million military dead, with millions more wounded or captured. Austria-Hungary endured losses so severe that its army never fully recovered. Germany's eastern casualties, though smaller than in the West, were still immense. Civilians bore an equally devastating toll through deportations, famine, disease, pogroms, and displacement. The numbers blur in abstraction, but on the ground they were faces. A young peasant conscript from Smolensk who froze in a Carpathian trench. A Hungarian officer cut down in a Galician wheat field. A Jewish family driven from their home amid suspicion and fear. A Romanian infantryman retreating through mountain passes as snow began to fall. A Latvian villager watching one flag lower and another rise, uncertain which language to teach her children. The Eastern Front was not defined solely by trenches. It was defined by movement and by collapse. In the West, the war ended with armistice lines and diplomatic settlements. In the East, it dissolved into revolution and civil war. The Tsar fell. The Habsburg monarchy shattered. Germany's empire collapsed. The Ottoman realm fragmented. From the ruins emerged Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. The violence did not end neatly in November 1918. In Russia, civil war consumed the land until 1920 and beyond. The Baltic region fought for survival against Bolshevik and German forces. Poland battled Soviet armies in a struggle that determined its eastern border. Ukraine became a battleground of competing visions. The rifles of the Eastern Front continued firing long after Western Europe laid down its arms. Why, then, is it often remembered less vividly? Partly because it lacked a single static line that could be memorialized easily. Partly because its aftermath blurred into revolution and redrawing of borders. Partly because the Western Front, with its industrial slaughter concentrated in famous battles, became a symbol of the entire war in popular imagination. But the Eastern Front was not secondary in impact. It destroyed empires. It reshaped the map of Europe. It seeded political ideologies that would define the 20th century. It unleashed forces of nationalism and revolution that would erupt again in 1939 and beyond. The war in the East revealed the fragility of multi-ethnic empires under the strain of total war. Austria-Hungary's diversity became weakness when loyalty fractured under pressure. Russia's vastness became liability when railways failed and hunger spread. Germany's tactical brilliance could not offset the strategic consequences of overstretch. The human suffering was immense and often intimate. In deportation marches during the Great Retreat, Elderly villagers collapsed along frozen roads. In prisoner-of-war camps, men endured years of captivity far from home. In occupied territories, civilians navigated shifting authorities and survival strategies. Disease, typhus, influenza, dysentery, claimed lives silently where bullets did not. The winter of 1918 and 1919 saw another killer, the influenza pandemic. It swept across Eastern Europe with merciless speed, striking populations already weakened by war and famine. The line between war casualty and pandemic victim blurred. Memory itself became contested. In Soviet narratives, the First World War was framed as an imperialist conflict superseded by revolutionary triumph. In successor states of Austria-Hungary, national independence overshadowed remembrance of imperial campaigns. In Germany, focus shifted toward grievances of Versailles and the coming political storms. The graves remained, but the stories fractured. Yet the Eastern Front's legacy lived on in new conflicts. The bitterness of Brest-Litovsk influenced German strategic thinking. The territorial disputes of Poland and the Baltic states shaped interwar tensions. The Soviet Union, forged in civil war, emerged with a worldview shaped by invasion and survival. The seeds of future confrontations were planted in the soil of 1914 through 1918. The fields of Galicia and Poland, once churned by artillery, eventually returned to agriculture. Children played where trenches once ran. Railways were rebuilt, cities reconstructed, but beneath the surface lay unexploded shells and buried memories. In the Carpathian Mountains, hikers now pass remnants of fortifications carved into stone. Moss grows over concrete bunkers. The wind moves through empty embrasures where machine guns once waited. In East Prussia, much of which became part of Poland and the Soviet Union after the Second World War, the landscape bears layers of conflict. Tannenberg's ground saw new armies decades later. The Eastern Front was a crucible not only of death but of transformation. It accelerated the decline of monarchy and the rise of mass politics. It demonstrated the destructive capacity of industrial warfare across vast rural landscapes. It blurred lines between soldier and civilian. It made entire populations participants in survival. The slaughter was not forgotten by those who endured it. Letters preserved in family archives speak of endless marching and frozen nights. Diaries recount confusion during retreats and fear during bombardments. Memoirs describe the eerie quiet after trenches were abandoned, the unsettling calm before revolution. The war's Eastern theater also reshaped military thought. Encirclements at Tannenberg influenced German operational doctrine. Brusilov's tactics foreshadowed infiltration methods later refined elsewhere. The mobility of vast fronts demonstrated both opportunity and vulnerability in modern warfare. Yet despite its scale and significance, the Eastern Front remains less central in global memory than its Western counterpart. Perhaps because it resists simplification. It was not a single story of trench stalemate. It was a shifting mosaic of campaigns, collapses, revolutions, and rebirths. It ended not in a single armistice line, but in the fragmentation of power. And so the slaughter remains scattered, across maps redrawn, across cemeteries without uniform markers, across nations that emerge from its aftermath. From the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, from the forests of Lithuania to the peaks of the Carpathians, millions fell. They fell not only in the clash of empires, but in the chaos that followed. The Eastern Front reminds us that war's impact cannot always be measured by the fame of its battles. Sometimes its greatest consequence lies in what it dismantles. The Romanovs ruled for 3 centuries. The Habsburgs for nearly as long. The Hohenzollerns commanded a modern industrial power. By 1919, each was gone or transformed beyond recognition. The slaughter in the East did not merely cost lives. It cost worlds. And in the quiet fields where trenches once ran, the wind still carries faint echoes of artillery thunder, of shouted orders in multiple languages, of men marching under banners that no longer fly. The forgotten slaughter is not forgotten by history itself. It lives in borders drawn in its wake, in revolutions born from its strain, in the fragile peace that followed, and the conflicts that came after. The Eastern Front began as a collision of empires. It ended as the birth of a new, uncertain Europe. And the cost of that transformation was written in blood across the vast, restless East.